Long before the Almoravids unified the desert frontier, the Western Sahara was already governed by an intricate web of Sanhaja alliances, a system of tribes whose control over trade, mobility, and religious authority laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The origins of the Almoravid movement cannot be understood without first examining the Sanhaja Berbers who dominated the Western Sahara for centuries before the 11th century. The Sanhaja Confederation, particularly the Gadala, Lamtuna, and Masufa, formed a loose but influential network stretching from the Atlantic coastline of present-day Mauritania to the caravan towns of the southern Maghreb. Arabic geographers such as al-Bakri and Ibn Hawqal described these tribes as pastoral nomads who combined camel herding with strategic control of caravan routes. Their mobility allowed them to manage seasonal migrations across the desert, adapting to rainfall variability and the shifting availability of grazing lands. This environmental adaptability produced the social and military structures that would later underpin early Almoravid expansion. The Sanhaja economy centered on trans-Saharan exchange, long predating the Almoravid period. Caravans transporting gold from the lands of ancient Ghana, salt from the deposits of Ijel, and other commodities such as ostrich feathers and slaves moved through territories patrolled by Lamtuna and Masufa groups. Archaeological evidence from sites in Mauritania, including fortified caravan stations and early Islamic inscriptions found near Tikrit and Tagant, supports the written testimony of 10th-century geographers. These findings indicate a well-established exchange system that relied on Sanhaja knowledge of oases, wells, and desert topography. Control of these routes created wealth, but it also intensified competition among tribes, producing fluid alliances and frequent internal rivalries. Social structure within the Sanhaja Confederation followed hierarchical patterns common among desert pastoralists. Leadership typically rested with select noble lineages capable of coordinating migration patterns, organizing armed escorts for caravan protection, and mediating disputes among clans. Al-Bakri's accounts highlight the prominence of chiefs of the veiled people, an early reference to the litham-wearing traditions that would later become symbolic of Almoravid identity. Beneath these aristocratic lineages existed a layered network of warriors, dependents, and allied clans. The decentralized nature of authority allowed each tribe significant autonomy, but it also limited their ability to unify for prolonged campaigns or large-scale territorial consolidation. Islamic influence reached the Sanhaja gradually, beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries through contact with North African merchants and jurists traveling along the caravan routes. However, records indicate that Islam was adopted unevenly across the region. Ibn Hawqal notes that while certain Sanhaja leaders supported mosque construction and basic Quranic teaching, widespread religious instruction remained limited. Many groups combined Islamic practices with older Berber customary laws, creating a landscape in which doctrinal understanding varied significantly from one clan to another. This uneven Islamization would later become a central factor in the emergence of Almoravid reform. Interpretively, the Sanhaja case demonstrates how environmental constraints shaped early political structures. The desert's vast distances prevented the formation of centralized polities, but its trade corridors encouraged economic specialization and intertribal cooperation. As a result, the Sanhaja developed systems of flexible authority rather than rigid state formations. This blend of mobility and trade-based wealth created both opportunity and vulnerability. Opportunity in their ability to control long-distance exchange, and vulnerability in the constant challenges posed by rival tribes, shifting alliances, and the need to secure escort services for merchants. Another key interpretive insight concerns religious authority. The Sanhaja adopted Islam not through sweeping conquest or missionary campaigns but through gradual assimilation. Their adherents lacked the doctrinal uniformity seen in the cities of the Maghreb, where Maliki jurisprudence had already taken root. This contrast provided fertile ground for future reformers. When later Almoravid leaders demanded stricter orthodoxy, they were not constructing a religious agenda from nothing. They were attempting to impose uniformity on a landscape where Islamic practice existed but lacked cohesion. Material culture also offers evidence for pre-Almoravid organization. Archaeologists working in the Adrar and Tagant regions have uncovered remnants of early fortified structures, pottery styles influenced by Saharan and Sahelian techniques, and imported ceramics from North Africa, indicating consistent contact with Mediterranean markets. These findings point to the integration of Sanhaja communities into broader commercial circuits, even though their political organization remained tribal rather than state-based. By the early 11th century, the Sanhaja Confederation's political landscape had become increasingly fragmented. Competition between the Gadala and Lamtuna intensified, especially regarding control of southern caravan routes and access to valuable salt mines. Written sources suggest occasional conflicts over taxation rights and escort payments. Such tensions weakened the Confederation's cohesion, limiting its ability to respond collectively to external pressures or internal instability. This fragmentation created the conditions in which religious reformers and military leaders could rise by offering renewed unity and doctrinal clarity. The pre-Almoravid Sanhaja world was thus defined by mobility, trade, environmental adaptation, and gradual Islamic influence. These elements produced a society capable of significant economic influence but lacking the structural coherence necessary to form a centralized power. The Almoravid movement would later draw upon these same networks, tribal alliances, caravan routes, and shared lineage traditions, while transforming them through religious discipline and military reform. As Islam spread unevenly across the Western Sahara, varying degrees of religious knowledge and practice created the conditions in which new reformist movements began to develop. By the 10th century, Islam was present, but scarcely unified in practice. Islam entered the Western Sahara early in the Islamic expansion, but the process unfolded gradually and without consistent institutional oversight. Records from geographers such as Al-Idrisi and Ibn Hawqal indicate that Muslim merchants traveling between Sijilmassa, August, and the Niger Valley introduced basic teachings as early as the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Yet the Sanhaja tribes adopted these ideas through local intermediaries rather than trained jurists. As a result, religious understanding varied significantly between clans, generating a patchwork of interpretations shaped by oral transmission rather than formal scholarship. Archaeological evidence from early Islamic layers at Tegdoust, the medieval August, shows trade-linked Muslim presence, but little sign of structured religious administration, supporting the idea that contact existed without uniform conversion. The uneven nature of Islamization was reinforced by the vast distances of the Western Sahara. Caravans required weeks or months to traverse the routes, limiting the ability of any single religious authority to impose consistent doctrine. Interpretive autonomy, therefore, remained the norm. Some Lamtuna communities practiced elements of Islamic law in matters such as inheritance and oath-taking, while neighboring tribes retained pre-Islamic pastoral norms. Arab sources from the 10th century describe these populations as Muslims who mix custom with faith, a phrase indicating partial observance without full jurisprudential grounding. This distinction matters historically because the Almoravid reform movement would later present itself as correcting precisely these inconsistencies. Commercial pressures also played a major role in shaping early Islamic influence. The Sanhaja were deeply embedded in trans-Saharan commerce by the 9th century, transporting gold, salt, and enslaved persons between the Sahel and Morocco. With the rise of the Ghana Empire to the south and the expansion of Sijilmassa to the north, trade disputes intensified. Rival groups such as the Zenata challenged Sanhaja dominance over caravan routes. These conflicts forced tribes to prioritize security and economic alliances over religious consolidation. The result was a political environment in which Islam spread as part of diplomatic negotiation rather than as a cohesive spiritual reform. Scholars note that such conditions routinely produced fragmented religious landscapes throughout the early medieval Maghreb. Internal dynamics further complicated the situation. Leadership among the Sanhaja tribes relied on consensus-based authority, with elders arbitrating disputes and maintaining inter-clan relationships. This system worked effectively for pastoral societies but offered limited support for the institutional structures required to standardize Islamic practice. When disagreements arose, whether over trade revenue distribution or alliances with neighboring powers, tribes reverted to customary law rather than appealing to Islamic jurisprudence. Evidence from early legal references in al-Bakri's Book of Routes and Realms emphasizes that even by the mid-11th century, Many desert communities continued to prioritize tribal arbitration over Qadi-led adjudication. This reveals the slow and incomplete integration of Islamic legal authority. Fragmentation was not only political but also doctrinal. Traveling preachers, merchants, and occasional jurists introduced teachings from different Islamic centers, including Karawah, Cordoba, and Tahert. Their jurisprudential traditions, Maliki, Ibadi, and various ascetic tendencies, spread simultaneously. Without institutions to organize religious instruction, tribes absorbed whichever teachings arrived first or best fit local priorities. Modern historians regard this as a crucial factor in understanding why 11th-century reformist movements gained momentum. Multiple versions of Islam coexisted, often contradicting one another, generating uncertainty about proper practice and spiritual legitimacy. Competition among the Sanhaja clans reinforced fragmentation. The Gadala, positioned nearer to the Atlantic, developed independent trade connections that weakened their political alignment with the inland Lamtuna and Masufa. Sources describe tensions over caravan taxation and escort responsibilities, issues that directly affected tribal wealth. When disputes escalated, rival leaders invoked differing religious norms to justify their positions. This instrumental use of Islamic language, rather than adherence to a unified doctrine, deepened doctrinal ambiguity and signaled the lack of an authoritative framework. Archaeologists working in Mauritania have identified settlement layers from this period showing episodic abandonment, suggesting that conflict and shifting alliances shaped population movement. Despite these tensions, Islam continued to advance. By the 10th century, prayer practices, Islamic names, and selective legal customs had become widespread markers of identity. Yet these practices were not supported by formal institutions such as mosques staffed by trained jurists or schools teaching Maliki law. Instead, Islamic knowledge circulated through oral explanation and experience-based adaptation. Modern scholars describe this as a frontier Islam, characterized by flexible interpretation and limited doctrinal control. In this environment, leadership could shift rapidly, and charismatic figures capable of articulating clearer religious guidance held significant appeal. The cumulative effect of these developments was a landscape marked by political decentralization and doctrinal inconsistency. Trade opportunities expanded wealth but also intensified rivalries. Limited scholarly presence allowed multiple interpretations of Islam to coexist, and tribal structures resisted the formation of central authority. This combination produced a region where reformist movements could emerge with remarkable speed once a unifying figure and coherent doctrine appeared. The Almoravid rise must therefore be understood against this backdrop of partial Islamization and persistent fragmentation. These tensions set the stage for the arrival of a scholar who would redefine the desert's religious landscape. With the arrival of Ibn Yasin, reform moved from discussion to disciplined action. The emergence of the Almoravid movement is inseparable from the figure of Abdallah ibn Yasin, a Maliki-trained scholar whose influence reshaped the religious landscape of the Western Sahara during the mid-11th century. Sources such as Ibn Adhari's Al-Bayan al-Maghreb and al-Bakri's Book of Routes and Realms situate Ibn Yasin's origins in the Sou region of southern Morocco, an area known for its established centers of Islamic learning. According to these accounts, the Lamtuna tribal leader Yahya ibn Ibrahim encountered Maliki jurists during a pilgrimage or diplomatic mission to the north and sought their assistance in improving religious discipline among his people. This background demonstrates that the movement's origins were not spontaneous. They followed a deliberate attempt by Sanhaja elites to import authoritative instruction into a fragmented environment. Ibn Yasin's training grounded him firmly within the Maliki legal tradition, which by the 11th century had become dominant across the Maghreb. His jurisprudential background emphasized strict adherence to textual sources, structured communal practice, and the rejection of local customs that contradicted Islamic law. When he traveled south with Yahya ibn Ibrahim around the early 1040s, he entered a region where Islamic practice remained inconsistent and intertwined with tribal customary norms. Reports from al-Bakri indicate that the Sanhaja accepted elements of his instruction but resisted attempts to eliminate long-standing traditions. This initial resistance underscores the challenges Ibn Yasin faced in promoting doctrinal coherence in a decentralized tribal context. The reform effort took on a clearer structure with the establishment of a ribbit, a fortified communal center devoted to discipline, study, and military readiness. Although later narratives sometimes romanticize the ribbit as a monastic institution, historical analysis indicates it functioned primarily as an organized space for enforcing Maliki orthodoxy and shaping a cohesive community. Archaeological parallels from ribbats in the Sioux and coastal Morocco demonstrate that such complexes served as training grounds for religious instruction and coordinated action. For the Lamtuna and allied groups, the ribbit offered a new model of organization that complemented but also reshaped traditional tribal structures. It created a setting where authority derived from doctrine rather than lineage, marking a significant shift in regional political culture. Ibn Yassin's program emphasized three central components: strict observance of ritual obligations, the elimination of practices deemed incompatible with Islamic law, and the creation of a disciplined collective identity. His insistence on regulating marriage, inheritance, taxation, and oath-taking aligned the Sanhaja more closely with northern Islamic centers. According to Ibn Idhari, these reforms were initially controversial and generated conflict among the tribes. Some groups rejected his authority outright, while others viewed the rising movement as an opportunity to strengthen their regional position. These debates reveal how religious reform became intertwined with political calculation, demonstrating that the Almoravid emergence cannot be separated from broader questions of authority and control. The movement gained momentum as Ibn Yassin demonstrated the utility of a unified doctrinal framework for resolving disputes and coordinating military action. For the Lamtuna, whose trade routes were increasingly threatened by rival tribes, cohesion provided a strategic advantage. Reform thus served both spiritual and practical purposes. Modern historians argue that Ibn Yassin's success derived from his ability to translate legal doctrine into concrete mechanisms for social stability. His insistence on accountability, communal discipline, and clearly defined leadership roles gave the Sanhaja a structural coherence that had been lacking under traditional systems of consensus-based governance. Leadership transitions during this period further illustrate the movement's evolution. After the death of Yahya ibn Ibrahim, tribal authority passed to Yahya ibn Umar, a figure who supported Ibn Yassin's reforms and expanded the ribbit's influence. This collaboration between scholar and military leader became a defining characteristic of Almoravid governance. The emerging system balanced doctrinal authority with martial leadership, allowing Ibn Yassin's teachings to shape strategic decision-making. In this structure, religious legitimacy reinforced political power, while military success validated the reform message. The combination allowed the movement to expand beyond the Sanhaja base and attract additional support. As Ibn Yassin's influence grew, the ribbit evolved into a center for both instruction and mobilization. Its disciplined community offered a contrast to the fragmented practices of neighboring tribes, signaling the advantages of unified religious standards. The movement's growing reputation drew individuals seeking stability, legal clarity, and protection from regional conflict. Al-Bakri's accounts describe the expanding network of followers as people of the ribbit, reflecting their shared adherence to Ibn Yassin's teachings. This terminology later gave rise to the term Almoravitan, the Almoravids, indicating how doctrinal identity became the foundation of a new political formation. The reform movement also developed clear expectations regarding taxation and the distribution of resources, aligning economic functions with Islamic legal principles. By regulating trade, ensuring protection for caravans, and standardizing commercial practices, Ibn Yassin reinforced the idea that proper religious adherence could produce tangible economic benefits. These reforms further distinguished the movement from tribal rivals, providing incentives for cooperation and reducing internal disputes. The resulting stability contributed to the movement's rapid expansion during the mid-11th century. By the time Ibn Yassin's authority reached its height, the reform movement had transformed from a small circle of disciplined adherents into a significant regional force. It offered an alternative to fragmented tribal politics by grounding legitimacy in legal and religious standards rather than lineage alone. This transition marked the beginning of a new phase in Western Saharan history, one characterized by increasing political centralization and expanding influence. The Almoravid movement thus emerged not merely as a religious initiative but as a comprehensive restructuring of authority, identity, and governance. As religious coherence strengthened, political unification soon followed. As doctrine hardened, unity became a military asset. The consolidation of the Almoravid movement during the mid-11th century represents one of the most significant transitions in Western Saharan history. What began as a reformist initiative centered around Ibn Yassin's Ribat gradually evolved into a disciplined confederation capable of coordinated military action. The period between the 1040s and 1050s witnessed the transformation of the Sanhaja coalition, primarily the Lamtuna, but also subordinate lineages from the Masufa and Gadala, into a structured movement whose cohesion depended on shared doctrine, formalized hierarchy, and rigorous discipline. Contemporary accounts from al-Bakri and later summaries preserved by Ibn Adhari provide critical insights into this evolution, emphasizing that the Almoravid rise rested as much on organization and ideology as on battlefield success. The Ribat remained the center of this transformation. Initially designed as a space for religious instruction, it increasingly took on administrative and military functions. Ibn Yassin's insistence on communal discipline served not only theological purposes but also created a training environment where recruits learned standardized rules, shared responsibilities, and internal accountability. This minimized factionalism and reinforced collective identity. Archaeological parallels from Ribats in the Su region, though not directly linked to Ibn Yassin's foundation, show evidence of structured living quarters, storage areas, and small defensive works, features consistent with the Almoravid adaptation of the Ribat into a hybrid religious military institution. Within the Ribat, Ibn Yassin enforced strict adherence to Maliki jurisprudence, which served as the ideological basis for unification. The movement's emerging leadership interpreted this legal rigor as a foundation for both religious reform and political consolidation. According to Ibn Adhari, the early Almoravid community adopted a system of leadership where the emir held military authority, while Ibn Yassin retained doctrinal oversight. This dual structure prevented the concentration of power in a single figure and ensured that military objectives remained aligned with the movement's theological principles. It also allowed the Lamtuna to maintain influence while presenting the reforms as universally binding across tribal divisions. Military discipline emerged as a central component of the movement's identity. The Almoravids developed a system of training that emphasized coordinated action, loyalty to the emir, and internal enforcement of rules. Accounts from later generations describe their early forces as austere, minimally equipped, and organized into small, mobile units suitable for desert warfare. Although exaggerated portrayals of Almoravid severity appear in some literary sources, the broader pattern aligns with what is known about early Saharan confederations. Mobility, cohesion, and strict command structures were critical for survival in a volatile environment. The reforms provided precisely these advantages, enabling the movement to coordinate raids, defend caravans, and resolve internal disputes more efficiently than their rivals. A key development in this period was the adoption of jihad as a framework for expansion and consolidation. Modern historians caution that 11th century concepts of jihad varied widely across the Islamic world, but Almoravid usage drew primarily from Maliki legal interpretations. For Ibn Yassin and his followers, jihad signified the enforcement of proper religious conduct within the Sanhaja and the defense or expansion of territory governed by Islamic law. Al-Bakri notes that the early Almoravids directed their efforts first toward internal reform, targeting communities that resisted doctrinal discipline or engaged in practices considered incompatible with Islamic norms. This doctrinal justification provided a religious rationale for confrontation while also advancing the movement's political objectives. The ideological cohesion fostered by Ibn Yassin allowed the Almoravids to impose unprecedented levels of coordination on formerly autonomous tribes. The Lamtuna, who held long-standing prestige within the Sanhaja Confederation, used this new structure to solidify their leadership. Under Yahya ibn Umar and later Abu Bakr ibn Umar, tribal authority became closely linked to adherence to Ibn Yassin's teachings. This reshaped the nature of leadership in the region. Legitimacy now depended not only on lineage but also on alignment with a comprehensive reform agenda. This had the effect of elevating leaders who supported doctrinal rigor and marginalizing those who resisted central authority. Economic considerations also contributed to the movement's cohesion. By the 1040s, competition for control of trans-Saharan trade routes had grown increasingly intense. Rival tribes and external powers, including the Zenata and the Kingdom of Ghana, influenced caravan networks and challenged Sanhaja dominance. The Almoravid emphasis on internal discipline and unified command made their coalition more effective at protecting caravans and managing taxation. This created tangible incentives for smaller groups to affiliate with the movement, reinforcing the perception that Almoravid rule brought stability and economic benefit. Records from al-Bakri describe improved security conditions along certain desert routes during the rise of the movement, suggesting that Almoravid consolidation already had practical effects before major territorial expansions began. The early organization of Almoravid forces also relied on clear administrative roles. The emir directed military campaigns and coordinated alliances, while Ibn Yassin supervised legal matters and maintained doctrinal coherence. This division of responsibilities resembles later Almoravid governance structures, indicating that the administrative model of the empire was rooted in practices established during the movement's formative decade. The Ribit's community structure, strict, regulated, and hierarchical, functioned as a prototype for broader governance. This early integration of religious and administrative authority became one of the defining features of Almoravid rule in both the Sahara and the Maghreb. Over time, the movement's growing cohesion reduced internal conflict. Tribes that resisted the reforms often faced isolation or military pressure, while those who joined the movement benefited from stability and a clear chain of command. The combination of ideological authority and military effectiveness proved decisive. By the late 1040s, the Almoravids had established themselves as a formidable regional force, capable of projecting power beyond the Ribit and responding to external challenges. Their disciplined organization distinguished them from other Saharan confederations and prepared the foundation for the territorial expansion that would follow. By the early 1050s, the Almoravid movement had evolved from a doctrinal community into a military theocratic confederation. This development reflected the interplay between religious reform, political necessity, and environmental pressures. The Ribit provided the organizational nucleus, Maliki orthodoxy supplied ideological coherence, and the Sanhaja's strategic needs encouraged militarization. The result was a unified force capable of reshaping the map of the Western Sahara and, eventually, the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. This unity soon translated into territorial expansion. By capturing key nodes of the gold trade, the Almoravids secured the lifeline of their future empire. The Almoravid consolidation of the Western Sahara during the mid-11th century marked a decisive shift from internal reform to strategic territorial expansion. Having established a disciplined coalition under the leadership of the Lamtuna and guided by Ibn Yassin's doctrinal authority, the movement turned its attention to securing the trade corridors that linked the desert's northern and southern economic centers. These routes formed the backbone of trans-Saharan commerce and connected the Maghreb with the gold-producing regions around the upper Senegal and Niger rivers. Historical accounts, particularly those of al-Bakri and archaeological evidence from sites such as Oudeghhost, demonstrate that the Almoravid push toward these regions was not merely opportunistic. It was a calculated effort to acquire the resources required for sustained political influence. The southern campaign began with efforts to assert control over the regions bordering the Senegal River. These territories served as major entry points for gold originating from the broader Ghanaian sphere of influence. The Almoravids recognized that effective political authority depended on managing these exchanges. According to al-Bakri, caravans moving north from the savannas carried raw gold, agricultural goods, and slaves, while returning caravans delivered salt, textiles, and manufactured items. As the Almoravid movement expanded, they sought to regulate these flows by creating checkpoints and strengthening alliances with communities positioned near strategic river crossings. This process provided them with access to gold at lower cost and ensured that competing tribal confederations could not disrupt trade. A central focus of this southern advance was the region around Oudeghhost, an important commercial center located near the Mauritanian-Malian frontier. Archaeological investigations have uncovered remnants of stone structures, pottery assemblages, and imported goods that reflect Ouidaghost's status as a major trading hub in the 10th and 11th centuries. Control of Ouidaghost meant influence over merchants traveling between the Ghanaian hinterland and the north. Al-Bakri describes the town as prosperous, with markets that facilitated the exchange of gold and textiles. When the Almoravids extended their authority into this area, they gained access not only to gold but also to established commercial networks that linked Saharan tribes to West African polities. This shift held major political consequences. The Almoravids were able to direct revenue towards strengthening their military organization and financing further expansion. Control of trade routes also enhanced their legitimacy among the Sanhaja tribes, demonstrating that the disciplined order of the Ribbit produced tangible material benefits. The movement's leaders used trade wealth to supply troops, maintain mobile units, and acquire equipment difficult to obtain in purely pastoral economies. The ability to mobilize well-provisioned forces contributed to the Almoravids' growing reputation as an authoritative regional power capable of imposing order on contested routes. As the movement consolidated the southern corridors, it simultaneously advanced northward towards Sijilmassa, a major oasis city positioned at the northern terminus of the trans-Saharan trade system. Sijilmassa served as the gateway through which West African gold flowed into the Maghreb and, eventually, Mediterranean markets. According to medieval geographers, its merchants played a central role in regional commerce, making the city a strategic objective for any power seeking to influence the broader economic landscape. By directing military pressure towards Sijilmassa, the Almoravids aimed to control not just the flow of gold, but also the administrative structures that regulated exchange, taxation, and caravan logistics. The campaign to secure the northern route required a combination of negotiation and force. Sijilmassa had long-standing ties with various tribal confederations, and any shift in allegiance threatened established commercial balances. However, the Almoravids possessed two significant advantages. First, their reputation for enforcing strict discipline appealed to merchants frustrated with the instability that sometimes plagued desert routes. Second, their consolidation of the southern corridors placed them in a position to influence the entire length of the trade network. Historical accounts indicate that by the early 1050s, Almoravid forces had asserted sufficient control to ensure the safe transit of caravans between the Senegal River region and Sijilmassa. The integration of these routes transformed the Almoravid movement's economic capacity. Gold from the south flowed through their territory, generating revenue that far exceeded the pastoral and limited agricultural resources of the Western Sahara. This economic base allowed the Almoravids to undertake longer and more complex military campaigns, secure alliances with northern Berber groups, and negotiate from a position of strength with Maghrebi powers. The accumulation of wealth also supported the development of early administrative institutions, enabling more efficient management of resources across a widening territorial domain. The conquest of the trade corridors also had important social implications. The Almoravids' regulation of exchange facilitated greater interaction between desert communities and West African societies. This included not only economic transactions but also the spread of Islamic practice. As the movement enforced Maliki norms, they contributed to the standardization of religious life along the trade routes. While conversion was not imposed, the presence of Almoravid authority made Islamic law increasingly relevant to commercial contracts, dispute resolution, and local governance. This trend reinforced the movement's reputation as both a religious and political force. A key interpretive insight from this period is the extent to which the Almoravid rise depended on the parallel development of economic and military structures. Their ideological cohesion, developed earlier within the Ribbit, allowed them to project authority effectively across vast distances. Their capture of trade nodes validated their claims to leadership and provided resources necessary for continued expansion. This suggests that the Almoravid ascent cannot be understood solely in religious terms. It was equally an economic transformation driven by control of long-distance exchange. By the late 1050s, the Almoravids had secured both the southern and northern ends of the Western Saharan trade system. This accomplishment laid the foundation for future campaigns into the Maghreb and ultimately Al-Andalus. Their ability to regulate the movement of gold, goods, and people across the desert strengthened their emerging governance structures and reinforced their strategic position. As the caravans moved under Almoravid protection, the movement's leaders gained access to wealth capable of sustaining a broader imperial project. Economic power provided the means for further military expansion. Early administration turned a coalition into a recognizable state. As the Almoravid movement stabilized in the mid-11th century, its internal cohesion began to take on the outlines of what historians recognize as an early state. The reforms initiated by Ibn Yasin had already tightened religious discipline, but the next stage required structures capable of managing territory, enforcing norms, and coordinating diverse tribal constituencies. This administrative formation was not a sudden transformation. Instead, it emerged gradually, shaped by the interplay of tribal leadership traditions, Islamic jurisprudence, and the practical needs of governance in a geographically expansive environment. The foundations of this apparatus rested on two pillars: military leadership and religious oversight. The Lamtuna lineage, dominant in the original coalition, provided the military commanders. At its head stood Yahya ibn Umar, a figure whose authority was rooted in both tribal prestige and proven battlefield effectiveness. Under his leadership, the Almoravid forces continued to consolidate territory, and it was during this period that the movement's military structure became increasingly formalized. Command hierarchies emerged, small detachments were organized around trusted captains, and discipline, previously enforced primarily through Ibn Yasin's religious authority, was institutionalized through clear chains of command. Parallel to this military framework, the Almoravids developed a jurisprudential infrastructure shaped by Maliki orthodoxy. Ibn Yasin's insistence on uncompromising adherence to Maliki doctrine created the ideological backbone of governance, but translating doctrine into administration required designated judges, legal advisors, and religious supervisors who could standardize practices across the movement's expanding domains. The result was the emergence of a dual leadership structure in which military commanders enforced territorial control while religious authorities ensured doctrinal coherence. This arrangement reflected the practical realities of ruling tribal populations that were only recently unified and needed both discipline and legitimacy. One of the most significant figures in this developmental stage was Abu Bakr ibn Umar, cousin of Yahya ibn Umar and one of the key leaders trained under Ibn Yasin's system. After Yahya's death in battle, Abu Bakr's leadership became essential in reshaping the movement's internal hierarchy. He embodied the balance of military capability and religious piety that Ibn Yasin valued, and under his guidance, administrative functions expanded beyond basic military organization. Abu Bakr's tenure would eventually see the Almoravids evolve from a coalition into an entity capable of sustained governance, tax collection, and territorial management. It was within this environment that the Ribat, originally the spiritual and military retreat established by Ibn Yasin, became not just a training center but an administrative nucleus. The Ribat provided a stable location for instruction, deliberation, and planning, allowing leaders to coordinate campaigns, adjudicate disputes, and refine doctrinal policy. While Almoravid governance remained mobile in many respects, reflecting the desert setting in which it emerged, the Ribat ensured that the movement maintained a fixed ideological and administrative anchor. The spread of Maliki jurisprudence within the state apparatus deserves particular attention. Unlike the more flexible customary laws that governed Saharan tribes, Maliki law offered a comprehensive framework for issues ranging from inheritance to taxation. The adoption of this system marked a shift from clan-based arbitration to standardized legal rulings. Judges appointed by Ibn Yasin and later by his successors traveled with the army, resolved disputes among the tribes, and enforced the moral and legal expectations that defined Almoravid identity. In effect, these jurists established a portable bureaucracy, one that could function in remote desert regions while reinforcing the movement's claim to religious legitimacy. This legal centralization had political ramifications. By empowering judges loyal to the Almoravid leadership rather than to specific tribal groups, the movement weakened older patterns of intertribal competition. Conflicts were increasingly adjudicated within a unified legal framework rather than through retaliation or negotiation between clans. This strengthened internal cohesion and helped align local loyalties with the emerging state rather than with traditional tribal authorities. Yet the state apparatus remained fragile. Its effectiveness depended heavily on the personal authority of Yahya ibn Umar, Ibn Yasin, and Abu Bakr ibn Umar. Administrative functions rested on loyalty networks rather than formal bureaucratic institutions, and the movement's rapid territorial growth meant that leaders were constantly balancing military needs with religious expectations and local negotiations. Nevertheless, the formation of a leadership hierarchy, combined with judicial standardization and the institutional role of the ribbit, created the essential components of a recognizable early state. By the late 1050s, these developments had reshaped the Almoravids into a coherent political entity. They could mobilize large military contingents, enforce consistent legal norms, and coordinate logistical operations across vast stretches of the Western Sahara. The early administrative apparatus did not yet resemble the later structures that would govern Morocco and Al-Andalus, but its foundations made such expansion possible. In effect, the Almoravids had moved beyond a religious movement and a tribal coalition. They had become a state in formation. With structure and leadership established, expansion into Morocco became the next strategic goal. The gateway to Morocco opened with the fall of Sijil Massa. The Almoravid entry into Morocco began with a clear strategic calculation. Controlling the northern terminus of the trans-Saharan trade was essential for transforming their desert-based movement into a power with influence across the Maghreb. That goal centered on Sijil Massa, a wealthy oasis city positioned at the edge of the Tafilalt Basin. Since the 8th century, Sijil Massa had served as one of the principal markets for the gold arriving from the western Sudan. Whoever controlled the city controlled the flow of bullion, the commercial networks surrounding it, and the political leverage that those resources made possible. By the mid-11th century, Sijil Massa was governed by the Meknasa, a Zenata Berber group whose authority had become weakened by internal disputes and shifting regional alliances. The Almoravids, by contrast, entered the region with rising momentum, strengthened by their earlier successes in the Western Sahara and the ideological cohesion forged through Ibn Yasin's reforms. The movement's leaders understood that Sijil Massa offered more than economic value. It represented the first major urban center they would encounter, and its capture would establish the Almoravids as a force capable of interfacing with, and eventually dominating, the sedentary polities of Morocco. The campaign toward Sijil Massa unfolded in stages. Abu Bakr ibn Umar, now the principal commander, advanced north with forces accustomed to the desert environment. Their mobility, discipline, and religious motivation gave them a decisive advantage over the fragmented defenders. Contemporary chroniclers such as Ibn Adhari note that the Almoravids applied both military pressure and ideological persuasion, appealing to Maliki norms that resonated with segments of the city's population. This combination weakened the authority of the governing elite while providing the movement with a foothold among local groups dissatisfied with the existing power structure. When Sijil Massa ultimately fell to the Almoravids, likely in the early to mid-1050s, it marked a turning point. For the first time, the movement held a permanent urban base, equipped with markets, agricultural resources, and access to long-distance trade. The city also contained established Islamic institutions, including mosques and judicial networks, which helped integrate Almoravid governance into broader Moroccan and Maghrebi traditions. Rather than imposing a wholly new system, the Almoravids adapted the existing commercial and administrative frameworks to fit their own doctrinal expectations. From Sijil Massa, attention turned toward the Dra Valley, a region of oases stretching along the southern flank of the High Atlas. The valley functioned as a vital corridor linking Saharan caravans with the agricultural zones of central Morocco. Its fortified settlements and irrigation networks made it an economically valuable location, while its geographic position made it strategically indispensable. Securing the Dra not only ensured Almoravid dominance over southern Morocco, but also protected the northern approach to the desert regions they already controlled. Campaigns in the Dra required different tactics from the assault on Sijil Massa. The valley's settlements were not large urban centers, but rather a dispersed series of fortified villages structured around palm groves and cannet-based irrigation systems. To manage this environment, The Almoravids employed ribat-based fortification, building or occupying military religious outposts that allowed them to project authority across difficult terrain. These ribats served multiple functions. They were garrisons, centers for judicial enforcement, and hubs for religious instruction. Their placement along key caravan paths enabled the Almoravids to monitor movement, collect taxes, and prevent rival groups from interfering with trade. The establishment of ribats in the Dra Valley demonstrated the flexibility of Almoravid governance. Instead of relying solely on tribal levies or temporary encampments, they implemented more durable institutions tailored to the geographic and political realities of northern expansion. The ribat system also reinforced the ideological dimension of their authority. By framing military presence as part of a broader religious mission grounded in Maliki orthodoxy, the Almoravids differentiated themselves from local elites who lacked comparable doctrinal cohesion. Economically, the impact of securing Sigil Masa and the Dra Valley was immediate. The Almoravids gained access to steady revenue from trade taxation, agricultural surplus, and artisanal production. Gold remained the most valuable commodity, but the Dra also offered dates, grain, and manufactured goods that sustained garrisons and supplied future campaigns. With these resources, the movement could now sustain larger armies, support scholars and judges, and fund construction efforts that legitimized their presence. Politically, these conquests expanded the Almoravid sphere of influence into regions where rival Berber groups had previously dominated. The decline of the Meknasa, coupled with fragmentation among the Mazmuda tribes of the High Atlas, created an environment in which the Almoravids could assert themselves as the unifying force capable of restoring order. Their combination of religious rigor, military efficiency, and economic control allowed them to negotiate from a position of increasing strength with local leaders and populations. The capture of Sigil Masa and consolidation of the Dra Valley also shifted the internal dynamics of the movement. Abu Bakr ibn Umar's reputation grew substantially, while the role of religious authorities remained central to political legitimacy. Yet the movement's rapid territorial expansion required more than charismatic leadership. It demanded administrative adjustments, new hierarchies, and regular coordination between commanders operating in distinct geographic zones. The early structures formed in the Sahara were now being tested against new challenges. Managing settled populations, maintaining supply lines, and coordinating multiple military fronts. By the end of this phase, the Almoravids had effectively secured the desert frontier and established stable control over the southern gateways into Morocco. They now possessed the logistical capacity, economic resources, and ideological coherence necessary to push deeper into the Maghreb. With the desert frontier secured, attention shifted north. The creation of Marrakesh marked the Almoravids' transition from tribal empire to urban power. The establishment of Marrakesh in the late 1060s and early 1070s represented a decisive shift in Almoravid strategy. Until this point, the movement had relied on mobile encampments, fortified ribats, and the occasional occupation of existing urban centers. These structures had served the needs of a geographically expansive but primarily nomadic confederation. Yet, as the Almoravids extended their authority deeper into Morocco, the limitations of a decentralized command became increasingly evident. The founding of Marrakesh, attributed to Abu Bakr ibn Umar and his cousin Yusuf ibn Tashfin, provided a fixed administrative and military base capable of managing a growing empire. Most medieval sources agree that the site selected for Marrakesh lay on the House Plain, south of the High Atlas. The area was historically inhabited by Mazmuda groups and marked by seasonal camps, cultivated fields, and a network of shallow watercourses fed by mountain runoff. Its position allowed the Almoravids to oversee trade routes moving between the Sahara, the Sioux region, and the northern plains. According to later chroniclers like Ibn Adhari, the initial settlement began as a military encampment designed to house tribal contingents and centralize authority close to ongoing military operations. Archaeological investigations in the Marrakesh region support this description. Excavations conducted in the city's oldest layers reveal evidence of tent circles, temporary hearths, and early defensive earthworks, indicating that the founding phase relied heavily on the mobile traditions of the Sanhaja. Over time, These temporary structures gave way to more permanent constructions, including adobe walls, storage facilities, and administrative compounds. This gradual transition reflects the evolving priorities of Almoravid governance, from campaigning and consolidation to administration and long-term control. Abu Bakr ibn Umar, as the senior commander, directed the initial phases of settlement. However, it was Yusuf ibn Tashfin who supervised the city's architectural and administrative development. Their combined leadership ensured that Marrakesh was not simply an improvised camp but the nucleus of a future capital. Early accounts describe the construction of a central mosque, a necessary institution for enforcing Maliki orthodoxy and providing a venue for communal decision-making. Although later expansions, particularly under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, transformed the mosque into a monumental structure, its earliest form likely consisted of modest materials, assembled quickly to serve immediate religious and political needs. The placement of this mosque, along with the adjacent administrative quarters, helped organize the spatial layout of early Marrakesh. Surrounding these structures, tribal quarters were designated for the Lamtuna, Gudala, and Masufa contingents. Maintaining these divisions was essential for preserving internal cohesion during the city's formative years. The Almoravids drew heavily on tribal loyalties, and allowing groups to settle according to their existing affiliations reduced friction and ensured reliable military mobilization. The need for water was a critical factor shaping the city's early development. Archaeological surveys have identified remnants of Katara systems, underground channels that transported water from the high Atlas foothills to the plain. Whether these systems were initiated by the Almoravids or adapted from pre-existing local techniques remains debated, but their expansion under Almoravid rule is well documented. Establishing reliable water access enabled the cultivation of fields around the settlement, providing food for the garrisons and supporting the eventual growth of a civilian population. As Marrakesh expanded, it increasingly became the administrative center of the Almoravid realm. Abu Bakr ibn Umar recognized the necessity of a fixed capital but did not remain in Marrakesh for long. In accordance with the division of responsibilities between him and Yusuf ibn Tashfin, Abu Bakr soon returned south to address conflicts in the Sahara. His departure, recorded in several Arabic sources, effectively transferred responsibility for the city's development to Yusuf. This transition proved decisive. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's leadership, more oriented toward statecraft and long-term governance, shaped Marrakesh into a functional urban capital. Under Yusuf's oversight, Marrakesh began to acquire the characteristics of a structured city. Defensive walls were strengthened with rammed earth construction, forming an enclosure that protected administrative facilities, storage reserves, and residential areas. Markets were established near the central mosque, following Islamic urban norms that placed commercial activity within reach of judicial and religious authority. These markets facilitated the integration of merchants from the Sioux region, the Dra Valley, and northern Morocco, gradually transforming the city into a commercial hub. The Almoravids also used Marrakesh to anchor their ideological program. Maliki jurists were invited to the city, strengthening judicial consistency across the expanding empire. Their presence reinforced the Almoravid claim to religious legitimacy and provided administrative tools for managing territories with diverse customs. Over time, Marrakesh became a center not only for governance but also for the dissemination of Almoravid religious doctrine. One of the most significant developments during this early phase was the construction of additional ribats around Marrakesh. These fortified outposts extended Almoravid control into the surrounding plains and secured supply lines feeding into the city. Their placement indicates a deliberate strategy. Marrakesh was not merely a military headquarters, but the foundation for an integrated territorial state. The surrounding network of ribats helped defend the city from hostile Mazmuda factions and ensured that Almoravid authority remained stable as the capital grew. By the early 1070s, Marrakesh had become the operational center of the Almoravid movement. Its emergence signaled a clear departure from purely tribal modes of organization. The city enabled the Almoravids to manage taxation, logistics, and judicial affairs more efficiently than would have been possible for mobile encampments. It also provided a platform for diplomatic engagement with neighboring polities, including the Idrisid remnants in northern Morocco and the various tribal coalitions that still controlled the Middle Atlas. In addition to its administrative functions, Marrakesh played a crucial military role. The city's location near the base of the High Atlas gave the Almoravids a strategic vantage point for campaigns directed toward the Sioux, the Anti-Atlas, and eventually the northern plains. Supply depots within the city supported extended operations, while its central position allowed for rapid deployment of forces across multiple fronts. By the end of this period, Marrakesh had moved beyond its origins as a fortified encampment. It had become a recognizable urban center equipped with religious institutions, administrative systems, and defensive infrastructure. These developments enabled the Almoravids to administer their expanding territories more effectively and provided the logistical base necessary for further campaigns into Morocco. With an emerging capital, the movement advanced deeper into Morocco. With Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid movement gained its most capable architect. The rise of Yusuf ibn Tashfin marked a decisive transition in Almoravid history. Before his emergence, the movement had grown rapidly under the joint influence of military leaders and reformist scholars, but its administrative coherence remained limited. Yusuf's leadership solidified the structures needed for long-term governance. By the late 1060s and early 1070s, he had transformed the Almoravids from a coalition of Sanhaja tribes into a disciplined political entity capable of ruling diverse populations across the Maghreb. Yusuf's ascent followed the departure of Abu Bakr ibn Umar, who had returned to the Sahara to address conflicts among the southern Sanhaja. Medieval chroniclers such as Ibn Idhari describe Abu Bakr's decision as strategic rather than a withdrawal from authority. He recognized Yusuf's administrative skill and trusted him to stabilize the northern territories. This transfer of responsibility proved foundational. Yusuf inherited a complex environment in Morocco. Tribal resistance persisted, newly acquired urban centers required regulation, and the movement needed a political structure capable of sustaining expansion. One of Yusuf ibn Tashfin's early priorities was organizational clarity. He began by strengthening the administrative institutions already emerging in Marrakesh. Maliki jurists, who had been invited earlier, received formal roles in adjudicating disputes and standardizing legal practice. Their presence helped reduce the regional variations in law that had characterized the pre-Almoravid period. This judicial centralization was essential for integrating conquered territories, each with its own customary norms. Records indicate that Yusuf issued guidelines ensuring that Maliki jurisprudence formed the basis of official decision-making across the realm. In parallel, Yusuf worked to rationalize military command. The Almoravid army still reflected its tribal origins, with separate contingents for the Lamtuna, Masufa, and Gudala. Yusuf introduced a clearer hierarchy centered around appointed commanders, reducing the reliance on lineage-based leadership. This shift did not eliminate tribal identity, but it strengthened overall discipline. Chroniclers such as al-Bakri note that Almoravid forces under Yusuf demonstrated greater coordination, especially during campaigns in mountainous terrain where independent tribal maneuvering had previously hindered operations. Yusuf also focused on internal security. After the initial conquests in Morocco, several regions, particularly the High Atlas foothills and the plains north of the Tensift River, remained only nominally controlled. Local powers, often linked to Mazmuda tribes or remnants of the Idrisid lineage, opposed Almoravid rule. Yusuf deployed forces to these areas to enforce taxation, secure supply routes, and prevent fragmentation. These campaigns were not as dramatic as the major conquests that followed, but they were crucial for stabilizing the southern Maghreb. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites near the High Atlas suggests Almoravid garrisons were established to monitor movement and ensure compliance. A key aspect of Yusuf's consolidation was economic regulation. With the Almoravids now controlling Sijilmasa, the Dra Valley, and the trade routes from the Sahara, managing commercial networks became essential. Yusuf reorganized taxation systems to ensure stable revenue from both trans-Saharan commerce and local markets. His administration standardized weights and measures in major trading centers, reducing discrepancies that had long complicated commercial exchanges. These reforms strengthened state authority and allowed Marrakesh to function as a hub for redistributing goods across the region. Politically, Yusuf ibn Tashfin relied on a combination of religious legitimacy and practical governance. The movement had originated as a reformist alliance centered on Maliki orthodoxy, and Yusuf maintained this ideological foundation. He expressed public deference to the teachings of Abdullah ibn Yassin, even after the scholar's death, reinforcing the movement's identity as a guardian of correct practice. However, Yusuf also adapted his rule to the realities of governing diverse populations, including urban communities that had little connection to the Sanhaja reform tradition. His balanced approach helped him secure support from both tribal elites and urban merchants. As Yusuf consolidated control, his political status evolved. Medieval sources indicate that Abu Bakr ibn Umar, before returning to the desert, acknowledged Yusuf as his successor in the north and reportedly encouraged populations to obey him. This endorsement provided Yusuf with legitimacy while allowing him to exercise independent authority. Over time, his leadership extended far beyond the scope originally envisioned by the early Almoravid commanders. Marrakesh became the center of a unified political domain whose influence spanned from the High Atlas to the Sahara. Yusuf's role as a unifier also became clear in his handling of external diplomacy. Relations with groups in northern Morocco required careful negotiation as well as military readiness. By presenting Almoravid rule as both religiously sanctioned and administratively stable, Yusuf attracted allies among urban elites who sought predictable governance. His ability to combine military strength with administrative order contributed to the movement's growing acceptance across the region. By the early 1080s, Yusuf ibn Tashfin had achieved significant consolidation of Almoravid power in the southern Maghreb. The movement had shifted from a loosely coordinated tribal coalition into a centralized authority with a functioning capital, consistent legal institutions, and a coordinated military. These developments enabled the Almoravids to project power beyond their original sphere and confront larger regional challenges. The consolidation under Yusuf created the structural foundations for expansion. With the southern regions stabilized, administrative systems in place, and Marrakesh functioning as a capital in practice as well as name, the Almoravids were able to turn their attention toward northern Morocco and the broader Maghreb. Yusuf's leadership thus served as the essential bridge between the movement's origins and its emergence as a major imperial force. The empire soon reached beyond the mountains. By the 1070s, the Almoravids advanced from the desert capital toward Morocco's most urbanized strongholds. The Almoravid advance into northern Morocco marked a critical turning point in the movement's transition from a regional power to a unified Maghrebi authority. After consolidating their position in southern Morocco and securing the trade corridors linking the Sahara to Marrakesh, Almoravid leadership recognized that lasting stability required control over Fez, Tangier, and the wider northern frontier. These regions contained the densest urban populations, the strongest commercial networks, and the most entrenched political traditions in the Maghreb. Their integration would complete the geographical and administrative arc necessary for a coherent kingdom stretching from the Senegal River to the Mediterranean coast. The capture of Fez, the oldest and most influential urban center in Morocco, was central to this project. Founded in the early 9th century by Idris II, Fez had developed into an intellectual and commercial hub with competing quarters and complex factional politics. According to geographers such as al-Bakri, the city's two main districts, Faz al-Bali and al-Aliyah, operated with considerable autonomy, each housing its own elites, guilds, and religious institutions. This fragmentation made Fez difficult to govern and vulnerable to external intervention. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's first campaign into the region occurred around 1069, when Almoravid forces advanced northward with the objective of imposing military pressure on Fez's leadership. Contemporary accounts suggest that this initial entry did not result in immediate, permanent occupation but weakened existing authorities and demonstrated Almoravid determination. The decisive conquest came in 1075, when Yusuf returned with a more coordinated force, securing both quarters of the city in a carefully managed operation. Chroniclers such as Ibn Adhari describe this dual conquest as particularly significant because previous rulers had rarely succeeded in subduing both sections of Fez simultaneously. Once control was established, the Almoravids implemented a series of administrative measures to stabilize the city. Yusuf appointed governors loyal to the movement's military and religious leadership, thereby reducing the influence of local factions and ensuring consistent enforcement of Maliki law. The new administration regulated commerce, improved the reliability of market oversight, and reinforced public order. These reforms aligned Fez with the broader Almoravid project of replacing local customary practice with a uniform legal framework grounded in Maliki jurisprudence. The city's intellectual prestige also contributed to the movement's legitimacy. Fez housed respected jurists and scholars whose recognition strengthened Yusuf's position among both urban and tribal populations. Although Almoravid rule introduced stricter doctrinal oversight, it also provided stability to institutions long affected by political competition. By securing Fez, the Almoravids gained a symbolically powerful urban base that complemented Marrakesh's emerging role as the administrative capital. Control of Tangier and Ceuta further enhanced Almoravid influence in northern Morocco. These cities, positioned along the Strait of Gibraltar, served as strategic maritime nodes linking the Maghreb to Al-Andalus and the broader Mediterranean. Tangier had been contested by various powers, including local tribes and external forces. Its capture allowed the Almoravids to regulate coastal movement, secure maritime trade, and restrict the operations of Andalusi or Christian fleets. Ceuta, long an important port with access to both African and Iberian markets, similarly strengthened the movement's economic and military posture. The significance of these coastal cities extended beyond commerce. They allowed the Almoravids to engage with political developments in Al-Andalus, where fragmented Taifa kingdoms sought external support against the expanding Christian realms of northern Iberia. The ability to project power across the strait would soon become central to Almoravid policy, but it depended first on securing the northern Moroccan coastline. By the late 1070s, the movement had accomplished this objective, laying the groundwork for future intervention in Iberian affairs. The consolidation of the northern frontier required more than the occupation of major urban centers. The Rif region, characterized by mountainous terrain and dispersed tribal networks, posed its own challenges. Almoravid expansion into this area involved systematic engagement with local groups whose political structures differed from both the Sanhaja tribes of the Sahara and the urban populations of Fez and Tangier. Military campaigns in the Rif aimed to secure passes, regulate movement, and integrate local leaders into the broader Almoravid hierarchy. Sources indicate that Yusuf's commanders negotiated alliances in some areas while enforcing compliance in others, creating a patchwork of arrangements that nevertheless acknowledged Almoravid authority. The control of northern Morocco also required securing communication lines between Marrakesh, Fez, and the Mediterranean coast. Almoravid forces constructed and reinforced fortified positions along key routes, ensuring safe passage for caravans and troop movements. These sites served both defensive and administrative functions, acting as nodes in a network that unified regions with distinct historical trajectories. Archaeological surveys in the Middle Atlas have identified fortified structures attributed to this period, suggesting the deliberate extension of governance into previously contested zones. By capturing Fez, Tangier, and the Rif, the Almoravids completed the territorial consolidation of Morocco. This expansion established a geographically coherent domain, linking the desert hinterlands to the Mediterranean world through a centralized authority based in Marrakesh. The movement now controlled the Maghreb's most important urban centers, trade corridors, and coastal ports. The transition from a reformist tribal movement to a regional empire was effectively underway. This northern expansion also strengthened Yusuf ibn Tashfin's political legitimacy. His success in integrating urban, tribal, and coastal regions under a unified administration demonstrated both military capability and administrative competence. The Almoravid state, once concentrated in desert territories and shaped by the Sanhaja social order, now governed a diverse population whose needs and expectations differed significantly from those of its original base. Yusuf's ability to manage this complexity positioned the Almoravids as a durable power in the Western Islamic world. With the major cities secured, the next challenge was turning conquest into administrative unity. After conquest came the task of aligning cities, tribes, and economies under a single system. The Almoravid consolidation of the Maghreb during the late 11th century required more than military victories. Once cities such as Fez, Tangier, Ceuta, and the Dra Basin had been secured, the movement faced the far more complex challenge of transforming a geographically diverse and politically fragmented region into a coherent administrative framework. This process unfolded gradually between the 1070s and 1090s, driven by Yusuf ibn Tashfin's insistence that political stability could only rest upon rigorous legal uniformity, religious discipline, and predictable taxation. In practice, this strategy meant expanding the doctrinal foundations laid during the early Saharan phase into urban environments, where competing scholarly traditions, economic interests, and local elites had long shaped governance. One of the Almoravids' most important administrative innovations was the widespread appointment of qadis and jurists trained in Maliki jurisprudence. While Maliki legal thought had already circulated in North Africa for centuries, the Almoravids institutionalized it as the empire's governing doctrine. They relied on jurists educated in major centers such as Aghmat, Kairouan, and later Fez, ensuring a consistent legal culture across both desert and urban regions. These qadis administered civil and commercial disputes, supervised market regulation, and served as intermediaries between local communities and the central government. Their presence reduced the influence of older legal networks that had blended Islamic norms with regional customs, replacing them with more standardized legal rulings based on recognizable Maliki precedents. The integration of taxation was equally critical. Historically, Moroccan cities and tribal territories followed irregular fiscal practices shaped by local leaders, seasonal pressures, and fluctuating trade. The Almoravids replaced this patchwork with a more predictable system. Zakat and agricultural taxes were regularly collected. Commercial duties were imposed on caravans entering major markets, and mining and gold trade profits were funneled toward military upkeep. The central government required each governor to maintain accurate account registers, which were periodically reviewed by emissaries dispatched from Marrakesh. These measures were particularly important in trade centers like Sijil Massa and Fez, where merchants expected reliable protection and clear transactional rules in exchange for taxation. To supervise these fiscal and legal systems, the Almoravids divided their territories into functional districts, each overseen by commanders drawn mostly from the Lamtuna elite. These men had proven loyalty during the movement's early Saharan campaigns, and their deep familiarity with Almoravid discipline made them suitable agents of governance. Although urban populations sometimes viewed them as outsiders, their authority was balanced by the presence of respected qadis and local notables. In practice, this dual system of military governance and scholarly oversight helped maintain a stable equilibrium between state power and civic expectations. Marrakesh emerged as the administrative heart of this network. Founded by Abu Bakr ibn Umar and expanded by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the city functioned as more than a military encampment. It became the center for correspondence, taxation review, and legal consultation. While the Almoravids did not develop the thick bureaucratic layers characteristic of later dynasties, Marrakesh housed scribes, treasurers, legal consultants, and emissaries responsible for distributing royal commands across the Maghreb. The city also served as the meeting place for tribal chiefs and urban representatives, creating a centralized space where the regime could negotiate disputes, issue decrees, and manage regional challenges. Fez, by contrast, retained its long-standing intellectual and commercial importance. Although the Almoravids appointed their own governors, they recognized Fez as a major center of learning and scholarship. The city's ulama preserved their role as educators and legal authorities, contributing to the empire's cultural legitimacy. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's policy of respecting Fez's scholarly autonomy enabled a productive partnership. The city provided jurists and intellectual prestige, while Marrakesh offered political direction and military security. This complementary relationship was essential for integrating urban elites into the Almoravid state without provoking resistance from well-established scholarly circles. Yet, administrative cohesion was not merely a matter of legal and fiscal organization. The Almoravids also needed to balance the demands of nomadic and urban populations, whose lifestyles and expectations could be sharply different. Nomadic groups valued autonomy, seasonal movement, and traditional patterns of leadership. Urban communities expected stable markets, reliable protection, and predictable taxation. The Almoravids attempted to bridge these differences by enforcing religious norms, particularly modesty rules, prayer discipline, and legal uniformity, across both groups. These norms acted as a cultural framework that softened tensions and allowed diverse populations to identify with a shared imperial order. Nevertheless, this process was not without challenges. Some urban sectors resented the austere moral standards imposed by Almoravid governors, viewing them as unnecessarily strict. Tribal leaders sometimes resisted taxation or administrative oversight, arguing that their service to the movement warranted exemptions. Rebellions within the Rif, sporadic disputes in the Dra Valley, and tensions around Ceuta illustrate the pressures the regime faced. In each case, the Almoravids responded with a mixture of negotiation and military intervention. Their willingness to deploy force, coupled with the authority of trusted commanders, preserved stability but revealed the limits of administrative integration in a region accustomed to local autonomy. By the 1090s, however, these efforts had produced a recognizable state structure. Taxation was regularized. Legal practice across the empire reflected a consistent Maliki orientation. Major routes, from the Sahara to the Mediterranean coast, were monitored by Almoravid-appointed officials. Marrakesh had matured into a genuine imperial capital, while Fez provided intellectual coherence. The integration of the Maghreb was not yet complete, nor entirely free of tensions, but the foundations of a durable administrative system were firmly in place. The success of this integration would prove critical for the next stage of Almoravid history. With internal governance stabilized, the empire could now turn its attention toward diplomatic and military engagement beyond the Maghreb, particularly in the increasingly volatile political landscape of Al-Andalus. Administrative unity opened the way for diplomatic and military engagement with neighboring powers. As the Almoravids consolidated Morocco, the wider Maghreb observed a rising new power. By the late 11th century, the Almoravid Confederation had stabilized Morocco to a degree not seen since the Idrisid era. With major cities unified under Yusuf ibn Tashfin and the trans-Saharan routes firmly secured, the political balance of North Africa shifted in ways that drew immediate attention from neighboring dynasties. The Zirids in Africa, the Hamidids in central Algeria, and a constellation of smaller Berber principalities along the frontier confronted the emergence of a disciplined, expansionist, and economically secure power whose influence stretched from the Senegal River to the Mediterranean. This section analyzes the diplomatic, commercial, and military interactions between the Almoravids and these contemporaneous powers, drawing on accounts from chroniclers such as Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Adhari, and al-Bakri. It situates Almoravid Morocco within a competitive Maghrebi landscape increasingly marked by fragmentation and regional realignment. The Zirids of Africa were among the most prominent dynasties observing Almoravid expansion. Once loyal vassals of the Fatimid Caliphate, they had steadily drifted toward independence during the 10th and early 11th centuries. However, their political fortunes changed dramatically following the Hilalian invasions of the 1050s, when Arab tribes, encouraged by the Fatimids, moved westward across Africa. The invasions devastated agricultural lands, disrupted taxation, and weakened Zirid authority outside the coastal cities of Mahdia and Sousse. By the time the Almoravids established control over northern Morocco, the Zirids were no longer a centralizing power capable of projecting influence beyond their immediate territories. Despite this imbalance, the Almoravids monitored Zirid affairs closely. The collapse of Zirid control over inland routes altered trade patterns across North Africa, redirecting merchant traffic westward toward markets supervised by Almoravid governors in Fez and Sijil Massa. This economic shift gradually enhanced Almoravid leverage, even without direct military confrontation. Diplomatic correspondence, as noted by Ibn Khaldun, suggests that Zirid rulers periodically opened discussions with Yusuf ibn Tashfin concerning safe passage for merchants and the treatment of travelers who crossed into Almoravid lands. These exchanges reflected a broader recognition that the political center of gravity in the Maghreb was moving westward. While the Almoravids did not intervene directly in African affairs, their growing prominence redefined the regional hierarchy. The Hamidid dynasty in central Algeria presented a more complex counterpart. Unlike the weakened Zirids, the Hamidids retained control over several prosperous urban centers, including Khalat Bani Hamad and Bijaya. Their coastal cities facilitated maritime trade with Sicily, southern Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean, creating a diversified economy less vulnerable to Saharan instability. Consequently, the Hamidids and Almoravids did not view each other merely through a military lens. They engaged in a subtle competition across trade, diplomacy, and cultural influence. One major point of friction concerned commercial rivalries. As Almoravid influence expanded into southern Morocco and consolidated control over Sijil Massa, they gained the ability to regulate a significant portion of the gold and slave trade flowing from West Africa. This development threatened Hamidid efforts to dominate east-west caravan routes that passed through the central Maghreb. Ibn Khaldun records several disputes arising when merchants affiliated with one dynasty faced tariffs or restrictions from the other, prompting diplomatic exchanges intended to prevent escalation. Although outright conflict between the two empires remained rare, the competition was palpable. Each dynasty sought to secure commercial advantage without committing to an expensive frontier war. Coastal trade added another layer of complexity. The Hamidids, possessing well-developed ports, were more maritime-oriented than the Almoravids, whose focus lay on desert and inland routes. Nevertheless, Almoravid control of Ceuta and Tangier granted them strategic access to the Strait of Gibraltar and the western Mediterranean. These acquisitions introduced a subtle geopolitical tension. Control of these ports allowed the Almoravids to regulate shipping between Al-Andalus, Morocco, and broader Mediterranean networks. Hamidid merchants increasingly had to negotiate with a rising Moroccan power whose naval ambitions were modest but whose geographic advantage was undeniable. Although the Almoravids did not establish a large navy, they possessed the ability to influence maritime flows in ways that complicated Hamidid commercial activity. Diplomatically, the Hamidid-Almoravid relationship oscillated between cautious cooperation and guarded hostility. Border incidents occurred occasionally, particularly along the Tlemcen frontier, where smaller Berber factions shifted allegiance depending on economic opportunity and political pressure. These independent polities, including the Maghrewa, the Banu Ifrin, and other Zenata groups, often acted as intermediaries or disruptors between the two great powers. Their raids, alliances, and disputes required constant monitoring. The Almoravids frequently dispatched commanders to suppress unrest or to ensure loyalty among wavering tribes, while the Hamidids pursued similar strategies from the east. In some cases, tribal leaders exploited the competition between the dynasties, negotiating favorable terms by playing one side against the other. Beyond the Zirids and Hamidids, the Almoravids interacted with numerous smaller polities across the central Maghreb. These groups, though limited in territorial control, exerted significant influence over mountain passes, caravan stations, and grazing zones. The Almoravids relied on diplomacy as much as force in these regions. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's government often offered tax exemptions, legal autonomy, or military protection in exchange for allegiance. When negotiations failed, Almoravid commanders occasionally resorted to punitive expeditions, particularly when disruptions threatened trade routes or jeopardized the stability of the empire's eastern frontier. Despite this complex landscape, the Almoravids consistently avoided overextension. Unlike the Fatimids or the Hamidids, they did not attempt to dominate the entire North African littoral. Their strategic priorities remained rooted in stabilizing Morocco and securing trans-Saharan commerce. However, their presence inevitably reshaped the regional order. The weakening of the Zirids accelerated the fragmentation of Africa into competing coastal and inland domains. The Hamidids, while still formidable, faced increased competition both economically and politically. Smaller Berber polities found themselves navigating a new balance of power in which the Almoravids represented the most disciplined and financially secure force west of the central Maghreb. By the end of the 11th century, the Almoravid rise had contributed to a broader reconfiguration of North African politics. The region's older dynastic orders no longer held the same authority they once enjoyed, and the vacuum created by Zirid decline and Hamidid fragmentation opened opportunities for a Moroccan-centered power to influence regional dynamics. Although the Almoravids stopped short of direct conquest beyond their eastern frontier, their stabilization of Morocco and control of trade networks ensured that no major North African power could ignore their presence. With regional stability achieved, internal structures and society became the next focus. Law provided the Almoravids with both legitimacy and social cohesion. By the late 11th century, Maliki jurisprudence had become the central ideological mechanism through which the Almoravid state defined authority, regulated social behavior, and organized governance. Although Maliki legal traditions were already present across parts of the Maghreb before the rise of the Almoravids, it was under rulers such as Abu Bakr ibn Umar and especially Yusuf ibn Tashfin that Maliki orthodoxy became a systematic framework for administering both urban and rural populations. Contemporary chroniclers, including Ibn Adhari and al-Bakri, frequently noted the Almoravids' insistence on maintaining doctrinal uniformity, a policy rooted in the movement's origins as a reformist coalition guided by scholars trained in the legal centers of the Sou and northern Morocco. Through courts, jurists, and legal enforcement, Maliki law became the unifying structure binding together regions that previously operated under diverse customary norms. The establishment of judicial courts marked one of the earliest institutional steps toward building a uniform legal culture. Almoravid rulers appointed qadis across the major cities, Fez, Marrakesh, Tlemcen, and Sijil Massa, each tasked with administering legal decisions based on established Maliki texts. These courts adjudicated cases involving property disputes, marital issues, commercial contracts, and criminal offenses. Historical references indicate that qadis were selected not only for their legal expertise but also for their reputational integrity. According to Ibn Adhari, Yusuf ibn Tashfin regularly consulted with senior jurists before confirming appointments, demonstrating the importance placed on ensuring that judicial authority reflected both competence and doctrinal reliability. The courts operated with procedural clarity, applying well-documented legal precedents from canonical Maliki sources, including works by Malik ibn Anas, Ibn al-Qasim, and Sanan. The enforcement of doctrinal uniformity extended far beyond the formal court system. Almoravid governance incorporated a broader apparatus designed to regulate religious practice and public morality. Market inspectors, known as mutasibs, monitored commercial activity in cities and ensured that transactions complied with legal standards regarding weight, measure, and contractual honesty. These inspectors also addressed public behavior, removing practices deemed unorthodox or inconsistent with Maliki teachings. Sources noted that activities such as alcohol production, certain forms of entertainment, and non-Islamic ritual practices were suppressed under Almoravid rule. This enforcement aimed to ensure a public sphere aligned with orthodox legal and religious expectations. One of the Almoravid regime's defining features was its willingness to suppress legal and theological positions perceived as divergent from accepted Maliki doctrine. Scholars associated with alternative legal schools or heterodox views encountered significant restrictions. Almoravid jurists and officials viewed doctrinal consistency as necessary for maintaining social cohesion across a geographically diverse empire. This approach reflected the movement's origins. Ibn Yassin's early emphasis on correcting religious practice influenced later generations, embedding reformist principles into state administration. While some regions of the Maghreb historically contained pockets of Abadi or Sharai influence, Almoravid authorities promoted a uniform Sunni orthodoxy, reducing the scope for competing interpretations. Maliki scholars held a prominent advisory role in shaping state policy. Their authority extended beyond judicial decisions, influencing taxation, market regulation, land allocation, and public infrastructure. Almoravid rulers routinely consulted leading jurists before enacting major administrative decisions. Chroniclers recount that Yusuf ibn Tashfin, despite his considerable military and political authority, deferred to the legal opinions of senior Maliki scholars when determining matters that touched upon religious law. This deference strengthened the perception that Almoravid rule was grounded in legal principles rather than arbitrary judgment. The involvement of scholars in governance also helped bridge the cultural and economic differences between nomadic and urban populations by providing a shared legal vocabulary. The integration of Maliki jurisprudence into rural and tribal areas posed greater challenges. While cities such as Fez and Marrakesh contained established scholarly communities, rural regions relied more heavily on customary tribal law or urf. The Almoravid strategy did not seek to eradicate tribal customs outright. Instead, officials often allowed local practices to continue where they did not conflict with Maliki principles. Over time, however, greater standardization emerged. Qadis and jurists traveled to peripheral regions to educate local leaders, mediate disputes, and promote consistent application of legal norms. This gradual dissemination of Maliki law helped draw distant territories into the administrative orbit of Marrakesh. The ideological role of Maliki jurisprudence also extended into the political justification of Almoravid rule. The movement's early cohesion was built around the reformist mission initiated by Ibn Yasin, and this mission evolved into a state-level claim to authority rooted in religious legitimacy. Almoravid rulers framed their governance as the restoration and preservation of correct Islamic practice, especially in regions where religious knowledge had declined or been influenced by local customs. Chroniclers describe sermons delivered in Marrakesh that emphasized the dynasty's role in defending orthodoxy and maintaining justice, themes aligned with Maliki legal thought. This ideological positioning was particularly important during the Almoravids' expansion into Al-Andalus, where political instability allowed them to present themselves as protectors of Islamic unity. The relationship between rulers and scholars, however, was not without tension. Some jurists expressed concern that political authority might overreach or apply legal principles inconsistently. In response, the Almoravids took steps to maintain scholarly autonomy, ensuring that prominent jurists retained independence in issuing legal opinions. While the dynasty benefited from scholarly support, it did not always exert direct control over the interpretive work of legal experts. This balance contributed to the stability of the Almoravid state by preventing conflict between the political and judicial spheres. Archaeological evidence complements written accounts of Almoravid legal culture. Excavations in Marrakesh and Fez have revealed administrative quarters and judicial buildings corresponding to the period of Almoravid rule. These findings suggest an expanding bureaucratic infrastructure capable of supporting legal and administrative functions. Inscriptions from mosques and ribats reinforce the emphasis on orthodoxy, often referencing Quranic verses related to justice, obedience, and moral order. Such material evidence supports the broader conclusion that Maliki jurisprudence was not merely a theoretical framework but a visible, embedded element of Almoravid governance. By the close of the 11th century, Maliki law had become the ideological backbone of Almoravid rule. It provided mechanisms for dispute resolution, regulated economic behavior, shaped public morality, and justified political authority. Its systematic implementation helped unify regions with diverse traditions under a shared legal system. This coherence strengthened state capacity and contributed to the stability of the empire during its peak. These legal frameworks influenced urban development and social organization. Urban landscapes transformed as Almoravid authority deepened. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Almoravid state oversaw a period of rapid urban development that reshaped the political and economic structure of the Western Maghreb. Cities such as Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat grew into administrative and commercial centers characterized by fortified architecture, expanding religious institutions, and engineered hydraulic systems. This transformation was not merely the result of population increases. It reflected deliberate policies aimed at consolidating control over diverse regions and rooting Almoravid authority in the built environment. Archaeological excavations and medieval written accounts, especially from Ibn al-Hari, al-Bakri, and later geographers, provide a detailed picture of how these cities evolved during the period of Almoravid rule. Marrakesh, founded by Abu Bakr ibn Umar and developed further under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, stands as the most significant urban project of the era. The city's early layout combined military, administrative, and religious functions. Archaeologists have uncovered sections of the original mud brick fortifications, which demonstrate a careful attempt to delineate the political heart of the empire from surrounding tribal settlements. These walls, constructed in phases, reveal the steady institutionalization of Marrakesh from an encampment into a planned capital. Contemporary accounts describe wide-open spaces for military mustering, administrative quarters for bureaucratic activity, and early market areas that served both the lamb tuna elite and the increasing number of merchants arriving from across Morocco and the Sahara. The Almoravid Mosque of Marrakesh, associated with Yusuf ibn Tashfin, further illustrates the dynasty's approach to urban monumental architecture. Although heavily modified in later centuries, surviving foundations and architectural fragments indicate a structure built to reinforce Maliki orthodoxy and provide a visual symbol of Almoravid legitimacy. Inscriptions referencing Quranic injunctions on justice and charity reflect the ideological priorities of the regime. The mosque's construction also followed standardized Almoravid building practices. Use of rammed earth, horseshoe arches, and a plan integrating prayer halls with courtyards designed to accommodate large congregations. These elements demonstrate a clear continuity between Almoravid urban religious architecture and broader Maghrebi Islamic styles. Beyond its architectural features, Marrakesh also developed a sophisticated hydraulic system. Excavations have uncovered the remains of Qattara channels, underground canals that transported water from nearby aquifers into the city. These systems allowed Marrakesh to support a growing population and maintain agricultural estates in its hinterland. Water management became crucial for supplying suburban gardens, public baths, and craft industries that relied on consistent water access. This hydraulic infrastructure demonstrates the Almoravids' ability to adapt technologies used in oases and Saharan towns to the demands of a capital city. Fez, while not founded by the Almoravids, experienced significant administrative consolidation and urban growth under their rule. When the Almoravids captured Fez in the late 1060s and fully integrated it by 1075, they inherited a well-established scholarly and commercial center divided into two older urban nuclei, the Karawayan quarter and the Andalusi quarter. Almoravid governance prioritized stabilizing these previously rival communities. Records indicate the reinforcement of internal walls, the repair of public markets, and the appointment of Almoravid administrators who supervised taxation and maintained order. Fez remained a leading center for Maliki scholarship, and Almoravid support for its academic institutions helped align the city's intellectual life with the legal ideology of the state. Urban expansion in Fez included the maintenance and improvement of water distribution networks. Hydraulic engineers restructured sections of the Oued Fez irrigation system to increase flow into workshops, tanneries, and residential districts. These improvements contributed to Fez's economic strength, as craft production and textile manufacturing became increasingly integrated into regional trade. Archaeological surveys of Almoravid-era layers reveal industrial installations such as dye pits and ceramic kilns, demonstrating a diversified urban economy supported by deliberate state management. Aghmat, located in the foothills of the High Atlas, served as a major commercial center prior to the rise of Marrakesh. Under the Almoravids, it retained economic prominence, particularly in trade and artisanal production. Historical accounts describe Aghmat as a cosmopolitan town with merchants from across the Maghreb, Al-Andalus, and sub-Saharan Africa. Although its political importance diminished after Marrakesh became the imperial capital, Aghmat continued to function as a regional hub for textile production and gold trade. Archaeological findings, especially remnants of fortified walls and residential compounds, indicate a stable urban environment adapted to Almoravid administrative oversight. The city's survival as an economic node demonstrates the Almoravid strategy of integrating pre-existing commercial towns into their broader network rather than displacing them entirely. A notable feature of Almoravid urban development was the systematic construction of ribats within or near major cities. These structures, originally associated with frontier defense and religious retreat, evolved into multifunctional institutions supporting administrative, military, and religious roles. Ribats in Marrakesh and Fez served as centers for training, legal instruction, and enforcement of public morality. Their architectural design, characterized by austere exteriors and internal courtyards, aligned with the Almoravid emphasis on discipline and religious order. The presence of these structures in urban contexts highlights the continuity between the early reformist ethos of the movement and its later state-level urban policies. Markets formed another essential component of Almoravid urban life. The state established regulated souks in Marrakesh and Fez, each with distinct zones for textiles, metals, foodstuffs, and imported goods. The appointment of market inspectors ensured that commercial activities adhered to Maliki legal standards. This regulatory framework fostered predictable economic environments that encouraged long-distance trade. Gold from the Senegal River region, leather from rural Morocco, textiles from Fez, and imported goods from Al-Andalus all passed through Almoravid markets. These cities functioned not only as political centers but also as nodes linking the Sahara, the Mediterranean, and Iberia. Urban demographics also shifted during Almoravid rule. Populations increased as rural migrants, merchants, soldiers, and scholars settled in the growing cities. The coexistence of nomadic elites and urban populations required administrative measures to manage housing, taxation, and social order. Marrakesh, in particular, expanded beyond its original boundaries as new neighborhoods developed to accommodate military units and trading communities. Fez similarly incorporated new residential quarters as its economic importance grew. These demographic changes reinforced the role of cities as centers of Almoravid governance and cultural formation. The Almoravid approach to urban development reflects an interconnected strategy. Cities served as administrative nodes, economic markets, judicial centers, and symbols of ideological authority. Urban planning was informed by both practical concerns, such as water supply and trade logistics, and broader state objectives, including the promotion of Maliki orthodoxy and the consolidation of political control. The architectural and hydraulic evidence from Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat demonstrates the scale of these efforts, while written sources highlight the administrative intent behind them. By shaping the physical and institutional structures of these cities, the Almoravids created durable centers of power that outlasted their political dominance. Their urban policies linked the Western Sahara, the High Atlas, and the Northern Plains into a coherent territorial system capable of supporting a multi-regional empire. Urbanization shaped the evolving social structure of the empire. Almoravid society reflected centuries of cultural exchange across Africa. Almoravid society in the 11th and 12th centuries was a complex, multi-ethnic structure that integrated tribal, urban, scholarly, and enslaved populations. At the foundation of this social system were the Berber tribes, particularly the Lamtuna, Gadala, and Masufa, whose leadership and military cohesion had driven the rise of the Almoravid movement. These tribal elites maintained control over military units, local governance, and rural economic production, particularly pastoralism and trans-Saharan trade. Their authority derived from both lineage and participation in the reformist religious ideology introduced by Ibn Yasin, which provided a unifying ethical framework. Chroniclers such as Ibn Khaldun highlight how these tribal structures persisted even as the Almoravids transitioned from a desert confederation to a centralized state, illustrating the enduring significance of nomadic social networks. Alongside the Berber elites, Arab communities, particularly those associated with mercantile activity, played a key role in urban centers. Cities such as Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat attracted merchants from Al-Andalus, Ifriqiya, and sub-Saharan Africa. These urban populations engaged in long-distance trade involving gold, textiles, leather, and luxury goods. Sources note that Arab merchants often operated semi-autonomously, but were subject to Almoravid regulation, including taxation and market oversight enforced by mutasibs. Their presence introduced linguistic, cultural, and commercial diversity to Almoravid cities, and their networks linked Moroccan markets with Mediterranean and trans-Saharan routes, enhancing economic integration across the empire. Scholars and jurists constituted another central layer of Almoravid society. They were responsible for the propagation of Maliki jurisprudence, administration of justice, and the instruction of students in both urban and rural centers. These scholars often enjoyed privileged positions within the cities, including stipends, housing, and influence in local governance. Their authority extended beyond purely religious matters, as their legal opinions guided economic practices, dispute resolution, and policy implementation. Archaeological evidence from Fez and Marrakesh, including madrasa foundations and inscriptions, attests to the physical infrastructure supporting these scholarly communities. The presence of these intellectual elites reinforced both the ideological coherence and administrative capacity of the Almoravid state. Enslaved populations, primarily drawn from sub-Saharan Africa, formed another component of the social structure. These groups were employed in domestic service, military units, agricultural labor, and artisanal production. Archaeological and textual evidence, including caravan records and Ibn Idhari's chronologies, indicates that the Almoravids imported enslaved labor to support both urban expansion and trans-Saharan trade operations. Enslaved individuals were often integrated into households or institutional structures, such as ribats and military contingents, and in some cases could achieve upward mobility through military service or domestic proficiency. While their labor underpinned the economic and administrative functions of the empire, their presence also reflected the broader patterns of African slavery and commerce during the medieval period. Intermediating between these groups were free urban laborers, artisans, and tenant farmers who participated in both local and long-distance markets. In Marrakesh, workshops and craft quarters specialized in textile production, leatherwork, metalwork, and pottery. These occupations were regulated by guild-like structures and supervised by officials who ensured adherence to Maliki legal standards, particularly in contracts, weights, and measures. The economic roles of these populations were essential for urban sustenance, providing goods and services to both elite households and the military apparatus. The Almoravid social hierarchy was also shaped by the integration of conquered populations. Northern Moroccan and Rif tribes, as well as Andalusi refugees fleeing Christian advances in Iberia, were incorporated into the empire in varying capacities. Some were settled in strategic urban or frontier locations, serving as militia, labor forces, or auxiliary administrative personnel. Others retained limited autonomy under local leaders, provided they paid taxes and observed Maliki jurisprudence. These incorporations extended the empire's demographic base while reinforcing political control through a combination of cooptation and supervision. Marriage alliances and patronage networks further reinforced social cohesion. Tribal elites often established marital ties with prominent urban families, while scholars cultivated relationships with ruling figures to secure resources for religious and educational projects. These connections facilitated the diffusion of Almoravid cultural and religious norms across diverse groups, bridging gaps between nomadic, urban, and rural populations. As a result, social hierarchy was not merely imposed but negotiated through a combination of coercion, ideology, and strategic alliance. Economically, the structure of society was tightly interwoven with the empire's trade networks. Control of trans-Saharan gold and slave trade routes, coupled with urban market regulation, created a system in which Berber elites, merchants, scholars, and laborers depended on one another for economic stability. Trade facilitated the movement of goods, people, and knowledge, reinforcing the multi-ethnic character of Almoravid society. Sub-Saharan imports not only supplied labor but also connected the empire to West African polities, while Mediterranean trade linked urban centers to Al-Andalus and beyond. This integration illustrates how the social hierarchy was functional as well as ideological, supporting both political authority and economic prosperity. Despite its relative cohesion, Almoravid society faced internal tensions. Nomadic tribes occasionally resisted taxation or urban settlement, urban merchants sometimes disputed legal rulings affecting trade, and enslaved populations were vulnerable to exploitation. The Almoravid response combined legal enforcement, religious ideology, and strategic concessions. By embedding Maliki jurisprudence and religious discipline into administrative oversight, the state provided a common framework that mediated social conflicts. Military presence and the deployment of loyal Lamtuna commanders reinforced this order, ensuring compliance while maintaining the empire's overall stability. In summary, Almoravid society reflected the empire's origins as a reformist Berber movement and its evolution into a multi-regional state. Tribal elites provided military and political authority, Arab merchants linked urban centers to trans-Saharan and Mediterranean commerce. Scholars reinforced ideological cohesion, and enslaved populations supplied essential labor. The interaction of these groups created a dynamic yet hierarchical social system capable of sustaining urban growth, legal uniformity, and economic integration. This multi-ethnic composition highlights the Almoravid ability to integrate diverse populations across North Africa and the Western Sahara under a common legal and political framework. The social system relied heavily on economic integration and long-distance trade. Economic strength traveled along the same paths as desert caravans. The Almoravid Empire derived much of its political and military power from its control over trans-Saharan trade, particularly the movement of gold, salt, and other essential commodities. By the late 11th century, the empire had consolidated authority over key trade corridors linking the Ghanaian Empire and the Sahelian gold fields with Oudaghost, Sijil Massa, and ultimately Marrakesh. Archaeological and textual evidence, including the accounts of al-Bakri, Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Idhari, documents the systematic integration of desert caravan networks into an empire-wide economic strategy. Gold, often mined in present-day Mali, was transported northward across the Sahara via camel caravans, passing through fortified trading centers under Almoravid supervision. This flow of wealth not only financed military campaigns but also reinforced urban development, religious institutions, and the administrative apparatus of the state. Salt, an equally valuable commodity in the medieval Maghreb, moved in reverse directions along the same corridors. The mines of Tagaza and Tawdeni in the central Sahara supplied enormous quantities of rock salt, a staple for both consumption and preservation in sub-Saharan regions. Almoravid officials regulated these shipments through taxation and the imposition of safe-conduct agreements for caravan leaders, ensuring predictable revenue streams while maintaining the security of long-distance trade. Caravan logistics relied on thousands of camels, whose capacity and endurance determined the volume and timing of commodity movement. Contemporary chroniclers emphasize the coordination required to organize such expeditions, including the deployment of guides, scouts, and armed escorts to protect against banditry or rival tribal interference. Oudaghost, strategically situated near the southern edge of the Sahara, functioned as a principal transshipment point. Here, gold and other goods arriving from the Ghanaian hinterlands were weighed, verified, and distributed northward toward Sijil Massa and Moroccan cities. Archaeological evidence, including remains of warehouses and fortified enclosures, indicates that Almoravid authorities directly supervised trading operations. Merchants were required to pay levies on goods passing through, generating income that funded both local administration and military operations. The concentration of commercial activity in Oudaghost also facilitated the movement of human capital, including skilled artisans, scribes, and religious scholars who traveled alongside traders, further integrating economic and intellectual networks. Sijil Massa represented the northern terminus of the trans-Saharan gold routes and the gateway to the Maghreb. Control of this oasis town allowed the Almoravids to dominate the distribution of West African gold into Morocco and subsequently into Iberia. Sijil Massa's urban infrastructure, including fortified quarters, caravanserais, and market halls, supported both permanent residents and seasonal traders. Evidence from coin hoards and numismatic studies reveals that Almoravid authorities minted currency to facilitate large-scale commercial transactions, demonstrating the integration of monetary policy with trade regulation. These coins, often inscribed with Maliki formulae, served as instruments of both economic and ideological standardization. The management of these routes required sophisticated taxation systems. Almoravid officials imposed levies on caravans based on cargo type, weight, and distance traveled. Documentation suggests that tax collection was conducted by trusted Lamtuna commanders or appointed qadis who combined legal oversight with fiscal responsibility. The enforcement of these taxes relied on a combination of physical presence, fortified way stations, and local tribal agreements. Merchants frequently coordinated with Almoravid authorities to ensure timely collection and compliance, resulting in an orderly economic environment that encouraged repeated commercial activity. Taxation revenue underpinned both military campaigns and urban projects, demonstrating the interdependence of commerce and state capacity. Camel logistics were central to the success of the trans-Saharan economy. Caravans often numbered in the hundreds, with animals carrying loads of gold, salt, and other commodities across desert expanses exceeding hundreds of kilometers. Routes were carefully mapped according to seasonal water availability, known oases, and prevailing winds. Archaeological evidence of resting stations and water cisterns along key corridors confirms the systematic infrastructure supporting these journeys. The deployment of camel caravans required specialized knowledge of desert navigation, animal care, and resource management, illustrating the technical sophistication underpinning the apparent simplicity of trans-Saharan trade. Almoravid regulation extended beyond physical transit to the documentation and standardization of trade practices. Records indicate that contracts, written in Arabic and occasionally accompanied by seals, formalized agreements between merchants and state authorities. These documents detailed obligations, penalties, and measures for dispute resolution. Legal oversight was closely linked to Maliki jurisprudence, ensuring that commercial transactions adhered to Islamic norms while protecting the interests of both traders and the state. This integration of law and commerce facilitated trust across vast distances, contributing to the durability of Almoravid trade networks. Trade under Almoravid authority also facilitated cultural and technological exchange. Gold and salt were complemented by textiles, ceramics, and books, allowing goods to flow alongside knowledge. Merchants acted as intermediaries, introducing agricultural techniques, artisanal skills, and intellectual practices from the Sahel, Maghreb, and Iberia. The circulation of these commodities reinforced the empire's multi-ethnic character, providing both material resources and social capital to urban centers such as Marrakesh, Fez, and Sijilmassa. Historical records highlight the movement of scholars and jurists alongside traders, demonstrating the intersection of economic and religious networks. By consolidating control over the movement of gold, salt, and other commodities, the Almoravids achieved more than wealth accumulation. Their authority over trade corridors functioned as an instrument of state building, linking distant regions under a single administrative and legal framework. The wealth derived from commerce-financed military operations, urban construction, and religious institutions, ensuring that economic power reinforced political and ideological objectives. Archaeological findings, including fortified caravan posts, coinage, and warehouse remains, confirm that the empire's economic infrastructure was both deliberate and extensive. In conclusion, trans-Saharan trade formed the backbone of Almoravid economic and political strength. Gold and salt, transported via camel caravans between West Africa, Ouaddaï, Sijilmassa, and Marrakesh, sustained both the state and its cities. Strategic oversight of trade routes, coupled with taxation, judicial regulation, and logistical coordination, allowed the Almoravids to integrate distant regions into a coherent imperial system. The movement of commodities also facilitated cultural exchange, linking the Sahara, the Maghreb, and the Iberian Peninsula into a network of commerce, ideology, and governance. These trade routes tied the empire to Mediterranean and Iberian markets. By the 11th century, Almoravid trade connected 3 continents. By the late 11th century, the Almoravid Empire had developed an economic network that extended far beyond the Sahara, linking West Africa, North Africa, Al-Andalus, and the Mediterranean basin. This system relied on both overland trans-Saharan trade and maritime commerce, creating a complex web of exchange in which gold, textiles, olive oil, and other commodities circulated alongside information, diplomatic contacts, and religious ideas. Contemporary chronicles, including al-Bakri, Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Adhari, describe the volume and organization of these exchanges, highlighting the Almoravids' role as intermediaries between diverse economies and political spheres. By controlling both the routes and the fiscal systems associated with trade, the Almoravids transformed economic activity into a tool of political cohesion and international influence. West African connections remained the backbone of Almoravid commerce. Gold produced in the Ghanaian Empire and surrounding regions flowed northward via the caravan networks described in Section 1. Historical sources report that merchants from Ghana, including local traders and representatives of the Sonic elite, coordinated with Almoravid officials in Oude-Ghost and Sigil Massa. These intermediaries ensured the proper documentation and security of shipments, negotiated tolls, and facilitated the distribution of coinage minted under Almoravid authority. Archaeological findings in Sigil Massa, including storage facilities and numismatic deposits, confirm that substantial quantities of gold passed through these nodes. The control of gold exports enabled Almoravid rulers to finance urban construction, maintain military units, and pay stipends to scholars and administrators, demonstrating the interdependence of trade and governance. In addition to gold, other West African commodities, such as ivory, cola nuts, and leather, traveled along the same networks. Merchants often combined shipments, maximizing caravan efficiency while distributing goods to markets in Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat. Ibn Khaldun notes that West African traders were treated as privileged partners, benefiting from legal protections and access to urban marketplaces. This collaboration allowed the Almoravids to integrate peripheral regions into their economic and political orbit, strengthening ties across cultural and geographic boundaries. The connection to Iberia constituted the second critical dimension of Almoravid trade. Following the arrival of Andalusi refugees and the escalating threat of Christian expansion in the northern peninsula, the Almoravids established both commercial and diplomatic links with Muslim polities in Al-Andalus. Merchants transported North African gold, textiles, and agricultural products across the Strait of Gibraltar, while Andalusi cities supplied manufactured goods, books, and technical knowledge in return. Historical records, including accounts by Ibn Adhari and later Andalusi historians, detail the establishment of merchant partnerships that facilitated both long-distance trade and the movement of military resources. Ports such as Ceuta and Tangier became crucial nodes for transshipment, functioning as points of exchange, taxation, and political negotiation. Mediterranean commerce further extended the reach of Almoravid economic influence. Italian maritime city-states, particularly Genoa and Pisa, maintained contacts with Maghrebi markets, exporting luxury goods, metal tools, and fabrics while importing African commodities through Almoravid intermediaries. These interactions required careful negotiation, including trade treaties and guarantees of security for merchants navigating both the sea and coastal territories. Documentary evidence, including Genoese trade records, indicates that Almoravid authorities actively regulated port access, assigned customs officials, and oversaw cargo documentation. By controlling coastal infrastructure, the Almoravids ensured that Mediterranean trade complemented their overland economic dominance. The integration of these three trade zones created a network in which commodities, information, and people moved in predictable patterns. Gold from Ghana financed urban expansion in Marrakesh and Fez. Salt and other staples flowed south to meet West African demand. Manufactured goods and scholarly texts from Al-Andalus enriched North African cities. Merchants operating within these networks were subject to Almoravid oversight but retained sufficient autonomy to facilitate rapid, large-scale exchange. This balance between regulation and commercial freedom contributed to the stability and profitability of the empire's interregional commerce. Trade diplomacy was a central mechanism for sustaining these networks. Almoravid rulers engaged in formal correspondence with neighboring powers, arranging agreements that protected caravans, ensured safe passage, and established mutually recognized standards for taxation and measurement. Letters and envoys documented agreements with both West African rulers and Iberian Muslim princes, providing legal and ritual assurances to merchant parties. Ibn Khaldun emphasizes that such agreements reinforced the perception of Almoravid authority as just and reliable, reducing the likelihood of conflict along critical trade routes. Diplomatic engagement thus served both economic and political purposes, integrating commerce into broader imperial strategy. Almoravid participation in Mediterranean trade also facilitated cultural and technological transmission. Artisanal techniques, agricultural innovations, and scholarly works moved alongside goods, enriching urban life in North Africa and contributing to the intellectual vibrancy of centers such as Fez. Andalusi scholars and merchants frequently settled temporarily or permanently in Moroccan cities, introducing Andalusi jurisprudence, architectural practices, and commercial methods. These exchanges strengthened the empire's ideological coherence, reinforcing the primacy of Maliki jurisprudence while promoting urban and economic sophistication. The financial flows from these networks allowed the Almoravids to underwrite military campaigns and consolidate territorial control. Gold revenue supported garrison salaries, fortification construction, and naval expeditions, while trade taxes financed administrative structures, including qadis, market inspectors, and regional governors. By aligning commercial, legal, and administrative mechanisms, the Almoravids converted economic connectivity into tangible political and military power. Archaeological evidence from Marrakesh, Sijilmassa, and coastal ports demonstrates how trade hubs were designed to accommodate both commercial activity and state oversight. Integration across Africa, the Maghreb, and Iberia also had demographic and social effects. Merchants, artisans, and scholars migrated along these routes, creating cosmopolitan urban populations in Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat. The presence of foreign traders and settlers facilitated the diffusion of cultural practices, religious norms, and technological innovations. Almoravid policies encouraged the settlement of trusted individuals in key cities to ensure loyalty, maintain economic stability, and reinforce ideological cohesion. These demographic patterns reinforced both economic efficiency and political legitimacy. Despite the overall coherence of the network, challenges persisted. Seasonal fluctuations, banditry, and political instability in peripheral regions occasionally disrupted trade. The Almoravids mitigated these risks through military escorts, fortified way stations, and alliances with local tribal leaders. Furthermore, economic diplomacy with external powers, such as the Hafsid and Hamidid polities, allowed the empire to negotiate access and reduce conflict in contested regions. The combination of administrative oversight, military security, and diplomatic engagement ensured that commerce remained a reliable pillar of Almoravid power. In conclusion, Almoravid trade extended across 3 continents, linking West Africa, North Africa, and Iberia. By regulating overland gold and salt routes, coordinating maritime exchange, and engaging in trade diplomacy, the empire created an integrated economic system that reinforced its political, military, and ideological objectives. Commodity circulation not only generated wealth but also facilitated urban development, scholarly activity, and cultural transmission. The empire's ability to combine logistical sophistication, legal oversight, and interregional cooperation illustrates the centrality of commerce to its expansion and sustainability. The same networks carried political appeals that would draw the Almoravids into Iberia. Economic stability depended equally on local production and global trade. While trans-Saharan trade and Mediterranean commerce provided the Almoravid Empire with substantial revenue, the stability and sustainability of the state also relied on effective local production. Agriculture and pastoralism formed the economic foundation of rural Morocco and the surrounding Maghreb, supplying both urban centers and military garrisons. Archaeological surveys and contemporary sources, including al-Bakri and Ibn Adhari, highlight the integration of traditional Berber pastoral systems with innovations in irrigation, crop management, and land tenure, demonstrating the practical sophistication underpinning Almoravid governance. Irrigation infrastructure was central to agricultural productivity. In regions such as the Dra Valley, Sioux Plains, and the foothills of the High Atlas, Almoravid administrators either constructed or enhanced networks of canals and canal-style channels. These systems transported water from rivers, springs, or underground aquifers to arable land, enabling the cultivation of cereals, legumes, and date palms in otherwise marginal terrain. Excavations along the Dra reveal remnants of terraces, retention basins, and channels designed to reduce soil erosion and manage seasonal water flow. These features allowed smallholder farmers to sustain yields while integrating the land into broader state-controlled economic systems. Pastoralism remained a complementary pillar of rural production. Nomadic and semi-nomadic Berber groups continued to manage herds of sheep, goats, and camels, which provided food, textiles, and transport. The Almoravid administration recognized the importance of maintaining mobility for herding populations while integrating them into the tax and conscription system. Tribes were often assigned seasonal grazing routes or rights to specific pastures in exchange for military service or tribute. This dual system preserved traditional livelihoods while reinforcing central authority, illustrating the balance between autonomy and state control that characterized Almoravid rural management. Crop regimes were carefully adapted to local ecological conditions. In lowland areas, wheat and barley dominated, while millet and sorghum were cultivated in semi-arid regions. Olive trees, vineyards, and fruit orchards were introduced or expanded in suitable microclimates, providing both subsistence and surplus for urban markets. Historical records indicate that the state encouraged diversification to reduce vulnerability to drought or market fluctuations. In regions surrounding Marrakesh and Fez, surplus grain and olive oil supported urban populations and military garrisons, while exported produce supplemented income from trade. Canot-style water channels represent a particularly noteworthy technological adaptation. These underground conduits, designed to minimize evaporation and maximize efficient water delivery, were either imported from existing North African techniques or refined locally under Almoravid supervision. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that such channels supported both small-scale irrigation and larger agrarian estates controlled by state or tribal elites. By stabilizing water supply, canots enabled continuous agricultural production, contributed to food security, and reinforced the political authority of local administrators tasked with maintaining infrastructure. Land management under the Almoravids combined taxation, oversight, and agricultural planning. Rural estates were often overseen by lamtuna commanders or appointed qadis, who collected tithes and ensured compliance with Maliki legal standards governing land tenure, labor obligations, and dispute resolution. Tribes and smallholder farmers were required to remit a portion of produce or provide labor services, with oversight mechanisms designed to prevent over-extraction or monopolization. This systematic approach integrated local economies into the imperial fiscal network without wholly displacing existing social structures, reflecting the Almoravid capacity to combine coercion with negotiated compliance. The interaction between agriculture and urban centers was critical. Marrakesh, Fez, and other cities relied on a consistent flow of grain, olive oil, vegetables, and livestock products. Administrative records and contemporary narratives indicate that surplus production from rural districts was transported via well-established routes, often paralleling the caravan paths used for trans-Saharan trade. These connections ensured that urban populations could be supplied reliably, supporting both civilian life and the operational needs of the military. The coordination of rural production and urban demand exemplifies the functional integration of economic sectors under Almoravid governance. Pastoral and agricultural productivity also underpinned the military apparatus. Camel and horse fodder, livestock for transport, and grain for garrisons were supplied from local production zones, allowing the Almoravids to maintain mobility and logistical independence. Chroniclers report that campaigns into northern Morocco and later into Al-Andalus were supported by prepositioned stockpiles, cultivated fields near strategic routes, and cooperative agreements with tribal leaders. The ability to mobilize local resources reduced dependence on long-distance trade alone, providing operational resilience and strategic flexibility. Technological innovations extended to storage and preservation. Granaries, cisterns, and walled compound fields protected produce from spoilage, theft, and environmental hazards. Evidence from Aghmat, Sijil Masa, and Dra Valley settlements indicates that Almoravid administrators implemented construction techniques designed to stabilize temperature and humidity, reflecting a systematic understanding of post-harvest management. These measures ensured that both local populations and urban centers could withstand seasonal shortages or trade disruptions, highlighting the interdependence of agricultural technology, administration, and economic stability. The integration of agriculture, pastoralism, and irrigation under the Almoravids demonstrates the empire's capacity to manage diverse ecological zones. By combining technological adaptation with administrative oversight, The state maximized production across mountains, plains, and desert margins. This approach reinforced social cohesion, supported urban and military infrastructure, and ensured that economic surplus was available to complement trans-Saharan and Mediterranean trade. In conclusion, Almoravid economic stability depended as much on local agricultural production as on long-distance commerce. Irrigation systems, canal channels, terraces, and pastures enabled sustained crop yields and livestock management, while administrative oversight linked rural output to urban markets and military logistics. This combination of environmental adaptation, technological innovation, and bureaucratic coordination provided the material foundation that allowed the Almoravids to finance expansion, consolidate authority, and intervene effectively across North Africa and, eventually, into Iberia. Economic capacity enabled the Almoravids to intervene decisively in Iberia. In Al-Andalus, political fragmentation created an urgent call for intervention. By the late 11th century, Al-Andalus was undergoing profound political disintegration. The central authority of the Caliphate of Córdoba had collapsed in the early 11th century, giving rise to a constellation of Taifa kingdoms. These small polities, such as Seville, Granada, Zaragoza, and Toledo, were frequently at odds with one another, competing for territorial control, fiscal resources, and dynastic legitimacy. Contemporary chroniclers, including Ibn Hayyan and Ibn Bassam, document both the internal rivalries and the inability of the Taifas to defend themselves effectively against external threats. This fragmentation created a political environment in which military and fiscal instability undermined long-term governance, leaving the region vulnerable to both internal insurrections and external incursions. Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, exploited this weakness. The rapid expansion of Christian forces, particularly under Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, intensified pressure on southern Muslim territories. The capture of Toledo in 1085 exemplified the strategic gains of northern kingdoms and triggered alarm among Andalusi rulers. This situation prompted the Taifa kings, particularly those of Seville and Granada, to seek external assistance. Al-Andalus had no unified army capable of countering Christian advances, and appeals for military intervention became a necessary political recourse. The Almoravids, under the leadership of Yusuf ibn Tashfin, were recognized as a capable, ideologically coherent, and militarily disciplined power. Envoys from Taifa rulers traveled across the Strait of Gibraltar to negotiate support, offering tribute and recognition of Almoravid authority in exchange for military aid. Historical sources, including Ibn Adhari and Ibn Bassam, indicate that these requests emphasized both the urgency of the Christian threat and the shared commitment to Islamic orthodoxy. The appeal underscored a broader pattern in medieval Islamic politics. Fragmented polities often sought external protection from more centralized or ideologically unified powers. The initial Almoravid intervention began in the mid-1080s. Yusuf ibn Tashfin mobilized forces from Morocco, deploying well-trained Berber cavalry supported by infantry drawn from urban and tribal contingents. Contemporary Andalusi historians note the rapid assembly of forces, coordinated logistics across the Strait of Gibraltar, and careful timing to ensure the reinforcement of vulnerable Taifa territories. This initial deployment illustrates the operational capacity of the Almoravids to project military power across both desert and maritime routes, a logistical achievement that was rare for the period. The Almoravid presence had both immediate and structural effects. On the tactical level, their forces reinforced key defensive positions around strategic cities, stabilizing previously vulnerable frontier zones. Commanders coordinated with local Andalusi troops, integrating them into larger formations while retaining oversight through loyal Berber officers. Archaeological evidence from fortifications in Seville and Córdoba corroborates historical accounts of Almoravid military construction, including walls, towers, and controlled entry points designed to withstand siege warfare. These measures reflected a combination of short-term military necessity and longer-term political consolidation. At the same time, the intervention had diplomatic dimensions. Yusuf ibn Tashfin negotiated terms with Taifa rulers that maintained nominal autonomy while recognizing Almoravid suzerainty. Tribute payments were formalized, judicial authority was increasingly aligned with Maliki jurisprudence, and Almoravid garrisons ensured compliance with both political and religious obligations. These arrangements exemplify how military intervention was coupled with administrative oversight, enabling the Almoravids to extend influence without immediate annexation of territories. By integrating legal and fiscal mechanisms into military operations, Yusuf ibn Tashfin created a framework that could support both temporary alliances and eventual territorial incorporation. The appeal to the Almoravids also illustrates the ideological resonance of the movement. The Taifa kings presented their request not merely as a pragmatic solution to military vulnerability, but as an invocation of shared Maliki orthodoxy. Chroniclers note that Andalusi rulers framed Christian encroachment as a religious and civilizational threat, legitimizing the Almoravid response as a form of jihad. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's forces were thus deployed not only for strategic purposes but as an instrument of religious and political authority, reinforcing the role of ideology in shaping medieval military interventions. This first Almoravid intervention set the stage for a broader transformation of Andalusi politics. By stabilizing frontier regions and reinforcing threatened urban centers, the Almoravids created conditions in which smaller Taifa polities could continue functioning while awaiting the arrival of a decisive confrontation with Christian forces. The movement of troops and resources across the Strait of Gibraltar also demonstrated the Almoravids' logistical competence, underscoring their ability to integrate North African and Iberian operations under centralized command. The intervention revealed both the opportunities and the constraints of cross-regional military engagement in the medieval period. Strategically, the initial deployment positioned the Almoravids for what would become one of the most consequential battles of the Iberian Reconquista. Control of river valleys, fortified cities, and communication routes allowed Yusuf ibn Tashfin to coordinate Andalusi and North African forces, maximizing operational efficiency. The integration of cavalry, infantry, and local auxiliaries enabled flexible deployment in response to Christian advances. Historians such as Ibn Khaldun and later Andalusi chroniclers emphasize that this preparation was critical in shaping the outcome of subsequent engagements, highlighting the link between administrative foresight, logistical planning, and battlefield success. The first Almoravid intervention also had socio-political implications. Urban populations in cities like Seville and Granada experienced both protection and oversight. Almoravid officials enforced Maliki legal norms, supervised trade and taxation, and oversaw local governance, ensuring that the intervention extended beyond purely military objectives. While these measures occasionally generated friction with local elites, they also introduced a degree of stability previously lacking in fragmented Taifa states. The integration of military, legal, and fiscal mechanisms exemplifies the multidimensional nature of Almoravid influence in Al-Andalus. In summary, the political crisis in Al-Andalus during the late 11th century created a critical opening for Almoravid intervention. Fragmented Taifa kingdoms, unable to resist Christian military pressure, appealed to Yusuf ibn Tashfin, resulting in the deployment of disciplined Berber forces across the Strait of Gibraltar. This initial intervention combined military reinforcement, administrative oversight, and ideological authority, stabilizing frontier regions while respecting local governance structures. Archaeological and textual evidence underscores both the operational sophistication and strategic foresight of Almoravid planners. By addressing immediate threats while establishing the foundations for longer-term influence, the Almoravids transformed a reactive military campaign into a platform for political consolidation and cross-regional authority. The crisis culminated in one of the most significant battles of the period. At Zalaka, Almoravid and Andalusi forces confronted a decisive Christian advance. The Battle of Sagrajas, also known as Zalaka, occurred in October 1086 and marked the first major confrontation between Almoravid-led forces and the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia. Contemporary chronicles, including Ibn Adhari and later Andalusi historians, provide detailed accounts of troop movements, composition, and tactical arrangements, allowing for a systematic reconstruction of the engagement. The battle was precipitated by Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile's rapid expansion southward, including the capture of Toledo in 1085, which exposed vulnerable Andalusi territories. The Taifa rulers, unable to resist northern incursions independently, relied on Yusuf ibn Tashfin's forces to stabilize the region. Almoravid forces were composed primarily of Lamtuna and other Sanhaja Berber contingents, organized into disciplined cavalry units supported by infantry drawn from both North African and Andalusi populations. Estimates derived from textual sources suggest that Yusuf ibn Tashfin deployed approximately 12,000 to 15,000 troops, though contemporary numbers vary. The Andalusi allies contributed additional forces under local commanders, though chroniclers note discrepancies in coordination and discipline between Almoravid and Andalusi contingents. In contrast, Alfonso VI's army combined forces from Leon, Castile, and allied Christian principalities, including heavy cavalry and infantry equipped with the standard arms of late 11th century Iberia. The selection of terrain played a critical role in the battle. Zalaka, near present-day Badajoz, featured a combination of open plains suitable for cavalry maneuvers and elevated ground advantageous for archery and defensive positioning. Yusuf ibn Tashfin utilized his knowledge of North African desert warfare to adapt tactics to the Iberian landscape, emphasizing mobility, disciplined formations, and the coordinated use of cavalry charges to disrupt enemy lines. Historical accounts indicate that Almoravid commanders deployed scouts to monitor Christian movements, enabling preemptive positioning and early engagement at advantageous locations. The chronology of the battle unfolded over a single day, beginning with skirmishes and probing maneuvers. Almoravid cavalry executed repeated flanking attacks, exploiting the Christian reliance on heavy cavalry and linear formations. Archers and infantry provided support from fortified positions and elevated terrain, allowing coordinated pressure across multiple fronts. Textual sources highlight Yusuf ibn Tashfin's direct involvement in maintaining command and adjusting tactics dynamically in response to enemy maneuvers. These measures contrasted with the comparatively rigid structure of Alfonso VI's forces, which struggled to adapt to the fluidity and speed of Almoravid operations. Tactical analysis indicates that the victory at Zalaka was not solely a product of numerical superiority, but resulted from disciplined coordination, effective use of terrain, and integration of cavalry and infantry roles. Contemporary historians emphasize the role of Berber cavalry in breaking enemy lines, while logistical planning ensured that supplies, water, and ammunition were available throughout the engagement. The integration of Andalusi auxiliaries, despite occasional coordination challenges, provided additional manpower and local intelligence, enhancing operational effectiveness. These factors demonstrate how strategic preparation and tactical flexibility were decisive in determining battlefield outcomes. Casualty figures, while difficult to verify precisely, suggest significant losses for Alfonso VI's forces, including the death of prominent knights and the capture of banners. Almoravid casualties were comparatively lower, reflecting both tactical advantage and disciplined troop management. The psychological impact of the battle extended beyond immediate losses. Christian forces were forced to withdraw temporarily from contested zones, while Andalusi populations gained confidence in the military capabilities of their new Almoravid protectors. The engagement established Yusuf ibn Tashfin's reputation as both a capable general and a stabilizing political authority in Al-Andalus. Long-term consequences of Sagrajas were significant. The battle halted Christian southward expansion temporarily, securing frontier regions and preserving the autonomy of key Taifa cities under Almoravid oversight. Victory also provided Yusuf ibn Tashfin with the political legitimacy to consolidate influence over Andalusi polities. Subsequent administrative and military arrangements, including garrison placements and the enforcement of Maliki legal norms, reinforced Almoravid authority. These measures illustrate the connection between battlefield success and institutional consolidation, demonstrating how military outcomes directly influence governance and integration in conquered or protected territories. The engagement at Zalaka also had strategic implications for broader Iberian politics. By demonstrating the effectiveness of a North African military intervention, the battle shifted the balance of power, compelling Christian kingdoms to adjust campaigns and negotiate truces in the short term. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of fragmented Taifa states and underscored the value of disciplined, centralized military forces capable of rapid deployment. Historians note that this intervention foreshadowed subsequent Almoravid expansion deeper into Iberia, ultimately leading to more direct political control over Taifa kingdoms in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Economic considerations were intertwined with the military outcome. Securing frontier regions allowed the continuation of trade routes between Al-Andalus and North Africa, including the transport of gold, textiles, and agricultural goods. Control over river valleys, urban centers, and fortifications facilitated taxation and administrative oversight, reinforcing the link between military success and economic integration. The victory at Zalaka thus ensured not only territorial security but also the uninterrupted flow of resources essential to both the Almoravid state and Andalusi cities. From a doctrinal perspective, the battle reinforced the ideological foundations of Almoravid intervention. Chroniclers emphasize that the campaign was framed as a defensive jihad to protect Muslim territories from Christian encroachment, legitimizing the movement's authority in the eyes of both North African and Andalusi populations. The integration of religious justification with military strategy illustrates how the Almoravids combined ideology and operational planning to achieve both political and spiritual objectives. In conclusion, the Battle of Sagrajas/Zalaka in 1086 represented a turning point in the Almoravid intervention in Iberia. Through disciplined troop deployment, effective use of terrain, and integrated command, Yusuf ibn Tashfin secured a decisive victory over Christian forces, halting expansion into key Andalusi territories. The battle's immediate outcome stabilized frontier zones, legitimized Almoravid authority, and reinforced both administrative and economic control. Its longer-term consequences shaped the trajectory of Iberian politics, establishing conditions for deeper Almoravid involvement and demonstrating the interconnectedness of military strategy, political legitimacy, and economic infrastructure. Victory opened the path for deeper Almoravid involvement. After intervention came direct governance. Following the decisive victory at Sagrajas in 1086, the Almoravids moved from military assistance to political integration, systematically dismantling the independent Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus. Between 1090 and 1102, Yusuf ibn Tashfin and his appointed governors orchestrated the annexation of key territories, transforming a fragmented peninsula into an extension of the Almoravid state. Contemporary sources, including Ibn Adhari, Ibn Bassam, and later Andalusi chroniclers, document both the chronology and administrative methods employed, revealing a carefully managed process that combined military enforcement, political negotiation, and legal standardization. The first targets of annexation were the southern and central Taifas, including Seville, Granada, Córdoba, Malaga, and Toledo. These polities, while nominally autonomous, had relied heavily on Almoravid military support to resist Christian advances. The imposition of direct rule involved the replacement of local rulers with Almoravid governors, often drawn from the Lamtuna elite or trusted Andalusi administrators loyal to Yusuf ibn Tashfin. In some cases, Taifa princes were retained in ceremonial roles under supervision, facilitating smoother transitions and reducing the risk of revolt. These measures exemplify the Almoravids' pragmatic approach, balancing coercion with negotiation to achieve political consolidation. Military presence remained central to the process. Garrison forces were stationed in strategic cities and frontier zones, ensuring compliance with new political structures and providing rapid response capability against internal dissent or Christian incursions. Archaeological evidence from Córdoba, Seville, and Malaga confirms the construction and reinforcement of fortifications during this period, including city walls, citadels, and fortified ribots. These structures served both defensive and administrative functions, reflecting the Almoravids' understanding of urban governance as inseparable from security considerations. Administrative integration involved the imposition of standardized legal, fiscal, and bureaucratic systems. Qadis trained in Maliki jurisprudence were dispatched to newly annexed cities to supervise judicial processes, enforce religious norms, and adjudicate disputes. Taxation was regularized, with land, trade, and urban levies coordinated to support both local governance and the broader Almoravid treasury. Documents from the period indicate that legal uniformity helped reduce conflicts among diverse populations, while taxation protocols enabled reliable revenue collection. The combination of military oversight and legal standardization ensured that annexation was sustainable beyond initial conquest. Urban governance was complemented by attention to economic and social structures. Merchants, artisans, and urban elites were incorporated into Almoravid administrative networks, with key positions assigned to individuals who could facilitate compliance with both fiscal and ideological mandates. Markets and trade routes were regulated under Almoravid supervision, integrating Iberian commercial activity with North African networks. Control over ports, river access, and overland corridors allowed for efficient movement of goods and resources, linking Andalusi cities to trans-Saharan and Mediterranean commerce. This integration demonstrates the empire's ability to coordinate political, economic, and military instruments simultaneously. Religious policy played a central role in legitimizing annexation. Yusuf ibn Tashfin emphasized the enforcement of Maliki orthodoxy, standardizing religious practices and suppressing heterodox interpretations that had proliferated under Taifa autonomy. Friday sermons, mosque appointments, and educational institutions were brought under Almoravid supervision, ensuring alignment with state ideology. Chroniclers highlight that this doctrinal uniformity reinforced political authority, creating a system in which religious, legal, and administrative structures were mutually reinforcing. The integration of Maliki jurisprudence into governance exemplifies the broader Almoravid strategy of combining ideological cohesion with territorial control. The annexation process also addressed the integration of military resources. Local Andalusi forces were restructured under Almoravid command, with tribal contingents, urban militias, and Andalusi levies organized into disciplined units. This reorganization enhanced operational readiness, ensuring that newly annexed territories could both contribute to and benefit from collective defense. Command structures were hierarchical, with regional commanders reporting directly to Yusuf ibn Tashfin or his designated deputies. Coordination of these forces highlights the empire's capacity to merge heterogeneous military traditions into a unified framework, a critical factor in sustaining territorial expansion. Cultural and social dimensions of annexation were carefully managed. Urban populations were gradually acclimated to Almoravid administrative and legal systems, while elite families often retained economic privileges in exchange for political loyalty. Andalusi scholars, merchants, and artisans were incorporated into the broader empire through patronage, education, and trade networks. This strategy facilitated knowledge transfer, economic integration, and ideological alignment, mitigating the risks of resistance and fostering urban stability. Archaeological and textual sources indicate that these measures were effective in maintaining continuity while extending centralized authority. By 1102, the majority of central and southern Taifa kingdoms had been absorbed into the Almoravid state, establishing a contiguous territory from the Maghreb across southern Iberia. Northern Taifas remained semi-autonomous initially, but were gradually brought under Almoravid influence through a combination of military pressure, alliances, and tribute arrangements. The annexation process exemplifies how the Almoravids converted temporary military intervention into lasting territorial control, demonstrating strategic patience, administrative skill, and doctrinal authority. This transformation created conditions for subsequent consolidation and expansion, laying the groundwork for the empire's peak in the early 12th century. In conclusion, the annexation of the Taifa kingdoms between 1090 and 1102 represents a critical phase in Almoravid state formation in Iberia. By replacing local rulers, establishing military garrisons, standardizing legal and fiscal systems, and enforcing religious uniformity, Yusuf ibn Tashfin integrated fragmented territories into a coherent imperial structure. Economic and social mechanisms complemented military and administrative measures, ensuring that annexation produced both stability and legitimacy. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that this process was systematic, deliberate, and effective, illustrating the empire's capacity to convert intervention into sustained governance. As Iberian territories stabilized, the empire entered its height. Under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the empire reached maximal stability. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Almoravid Empire under Yusuf ibn Tashfin had achieved a degree of administrative cohesion unparalleled in its early history. Drawing on the foundations laid during the consolidation of Morocco and Iberia, Yusuf implemented an integrated governance system that combined military oversight, legal uniformity, and fiscal management. Contemporary historians, including Ibn Adhari, al-Bakri, and Ibn Bassam, described the empire as a centralized polity in which both urban centers and rural regions were linked through disciplined bureaucratic and military structures, facilitating efficient governance across North Africa and Al-Andalus. Central to Yusuf ibn Tashfin's administration was the coordination of urban and regional authority. Marrakesh functioned as the political and fiscal hub, hosting the imperial court, military leadership, and administrative offices. Qadis trained in Maliki jurisprudence were deployed to major cities, including Fez, Córdoba, and Seville, to oversee judicial matters, enforce doctrinal conformity, and arbitrate disputes. Regional governors, typically drawn from trusted Lamtuna or allied Berber elites, managed provincial affairs, ensuring compliance with imperial policies. This hierarchical structure allowed for both centralized decision-making and localized execution, a combination essential for the stability of a multi-ethnic and geographically dispersed empire. Taxation and fiscal oversight were key components of this system. Yusuf ibn Tashfin standardized the collection of land taxes, trade duties, and urban levies, integrating both Maghribi and Andalusi fiscal practices. Revenue from rural agriculture, urban markets, and trans-Saharan trade was systematically channeled to the central treasury, funding military campaigns, public works, and court administration. Historical records indicate that this process relied on carefully maintained registers and oversight mechanisms, reflecting an advanced understanding of fiscal accountability for the period. By linking economic resources to state authority, Yusuf strengthened the empire's capacity for both defense and expansion. Legal administration was equally important. The enforcement of Maliki jurisprudence provided a framework for both civil and criminal matters, aligning diverse populations under a coherent ideological and judicial system. Judges were charged with supervising markets, regulating commercial contracts, and adjudicating disputes between tribal, urban, and enslaved communities. By embedding law into administrative structures, Yusuf ibn Tashfin ensured that governance was not solely coercive but also institutionalized, enhancing legitimacy and reducing the risk of arbitrary authority. This systematic integration of law and administration reflects the intellectual and organizational capacity of Almoravid governance at its zenith. Diplomacy complemented domestic administration. Yusuf maintained correspondence and negotiated agreements with neighboring powers, including the Hamidids, Zirids, and northern Christian kingdoms. Tribute arrangements, trade treaties, and temporary truces were employed to stabilize borders, secure trade routes, and project imperial influence without direct military occupation. These measures allowed the Almoravids to focus resources on internal consolidation and strategic campaigns while maintaining the empire's regional standing. Chroniclers note that Yusuf's diplomatic acumen enhanced both political security and economic prosperity, highlighting the multifaceted nature of imperial management. Military organization remained tightly integrated with administrative systems. Regional commanders reported directly to the central authority, coordinating troop deployments, garrison maintenance, and frontier security. Strategic forts and ribats reinforced both territorial control and logistical networks, linking urban centers, rural production zones, and key trade corridors. The Army's dual role as protector and enforcer of administrative policies exemplifies the symbiotic relationship between governance and military capacity. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's ability to balance military discipline with civil oversight was a decisive factor in sustaining imperial stability across diverse environments. Social and economic integration under Yusuf's administration further reinforced cohesion. Urban and rural populations were incorporated into the fiscal and legal framework, while tribal leaders maintained traditional influence in exchange for loyalty and compliance. Markets, infrastructure, and trade networks were coordinated to ensure both resource distribution and economic growth. Archaeological evidence from Marrakesh, Seville, and Fez reveals urban planning, granaries, and irrigation improvements consistent with centralized oversight. This synthesis of social, economic, and administrative management illustrates how the Almoravid state translated organizational capacity into functional imperial authority. Yusuf ibn Tashfin also emphasized succession planning and institutional continuity. Deputies and provincial administrators were appointed based on loyalty, competence, and tribal affiliation, ensuring a degree of stability beyond his personal leadership. Records indicate that administrative manuals, legal precedents, and fiscal protocols were systematically documented, allowing governance to continue with minimal disruption in the event of leadership transitions. These measures underscore the strategic foresight of Yusuf's administration, highlighting an understanding of the structural requirements necessary for sustained imperial control. The effectiveness of Yusuf's administration is further reflected in the empire's ability to respond to crises. Whether defending Iberian frontiers, suppressing internal revolts, or regulating trade disruptions, the coordinated structures of governance allowed rapid mobilization of resources and personnel. Central oversight of legal, fiscal, and military mechanisms ensured that responses were systematic rather than ad hoc. Historians interpret this as a defining characteristic of the Almoravid peak: the capacity to integrate multiple domains, legal, fiscal, military, and social, into a coherent, responsive imperial system. In conclusion, Yusuf ibn Tashfin's imperial administration represents the apex of Almoravid organizational sophistication. By combining centralized authority, standardized taxation, judicial oversight, diplomatic engagement, and integrated military structures, the empire achieved maximal stability across North Africa and Al-Andalus. Administrative efficiency allowed for sustained economic growth, effective governance of diverse populations, and operational readiness against external threats. The coordination of ideological, legal, and bureaucratic instruments exemplifies the Almoravid model of statecraft, illustrating how strategic leadership, institutional design, and practical governance converged to create a durable and expansive empire. Success set the stage for succession challenges. Ali ibn Yusuf inherited both the empire's strength and its vulnerabilities. Ali ibn Yusuf succeeded his father, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, in 1106, inheriting an empire that extended across Morocco and significant portions of Al-Andalus. Contemporary sources, including Ibn Bassam and Ibn Khaldun, note that Ali assumed control over a highly structured administrative system, disciplined military forces, and extensive economic networks. Nevertheless, the empire also faced mounting internal and external pressures, ranging from frontier defense against Christian expansion to managing increasingly complex fiscal and social systems. The period of Ali's rule demonstrates both continuity with his father's policies and the emergence of structural vulnerabilities that would later influence the empire's trajectory. Ali maintained the administrative framework established by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, retaining qadis, governors, and military commanders to oversee the diverse provinces. Marrakesh continued as the political and fiscal center, while Fez, Córdoba, and Seville functioned as regional hubs for legal, economic, and cultural coordination. Historical records indicate that Ali emphasized strict adherence to Maliki jurisprudence, reinforcing ideological legitimacy across both North African and Iberian territories. Legal and fiscal systems established under Yusuf were preserved, ensuring continuity in revenue collection, judicial supervision, and military provisioning. Architectural expansion became a hallmark of Ali's reign, reflecting both practical governance needs and imperial prestige. Archaeological evidence from Marrakesh indicates the construction of expanded city walls, fortified ribbats, public granaries, and water channels, demonstrating a coordinated effort to enhance urban infrastructure. In Iberia, fortifications in Seville, Granada, and Córdoba were reinforced to secure the empire's frontiers. These projects served dual purposes, supporting the logistical requirements of governance and symbolizing Almoravid authority to both internal populations and neighboring states. Military pressures increased significantly during Ali ibn Yusuf's rule. Christian kingdoms in northern Iberia continued territorial expansion, with intermittent raids and sieges challenging the stability of Andalusi provinces. To respond, Ali maintained a permanent military presence along strategic river valleys, fortified towns, and coastal positions. Berber cavalry remained the core of the army, complemented by Andalusi levies and urban militias. Records emphasize the importance of mobility, intelligence gathering, and coordination with local commanders to anticipate and counter Christian incursions, illustrating the ongoing operational demands of an empire engaged in continuous frontier defense. Internal governance also presented challenges. The integration of nomadic Berber populations with urban Andalusi communities required delicate management. Ali implemented policies to balance tribal influence with centralized authority, often redistributing command roles and adjusting tax obligations to maintain loyalty. Urban elites, merchants, and scholars were incorporated into administrative and fiscal networks, with incentives to support state cohesion. These measures mitigated potential unrest while reinforcing social and economic stability, highlighting the empire's reliance on both coercion and cooperation in sustaining rule. Economic and trade networks under Ali ibn Yusuf continued to flourish, benefiting from established trans-Saharan and Mediterranean connections. Taxation systems supported both military and urban development, while markets in Marrakesh, Fez, and Seville facilitated the circulation of gold, textiles, and agricultural goods. Maritime trade with Mediterranean ports remained active, ensuring that the empire could project influence economically as well as militarily. Chroniclers note that these networks allowed Ali to fund both domestic infrastructure and defensive campaigns, demonstrating the interdependence of governance, economy, and military capacity. Despite these strengths, structural vulnerabilities became increasingly apparent. The empire's extended frontiers, reliance on mobile cavalry, and integration of diverse populations created potential points of instability. Local Andalusi elites occasionally resisted central authority, and maintaining coordination between North African and Iberian provinces required constant oversight. Additionally, Christian advances in the north imposed ongoing military and fiscal burdens, straining resources and necessitating strategic prioritization. Ali ibn Yusuf's reign illustrates how leadership continuity preserved stability while exposing the limits of centralized control over a geographically and culturally heterogeneous empire. Cultural achievements during this period were significant. Architectural projects, mosque construction, and urban planning reflected the empire's ideological coherence and administrative sophistication. Scholars, jurists, and merchants contributed to a vibrant intellectual and economic climate in both Morocco and Al-Andalus. These accomplishments, while impressive, coexisted with persistent pressures, indicating that cultural flourishing did not eliminate underlying political and military challenges. Instead, they complemented governance, reinforcing legitimacy and social cohesion. In conclusion, Ali ibn Yusuf's reign represented both continuity and adaptation. He maintained the administrative, military, and legal structures established by his father, overseeing an empire capable of defending its frontiers, regulating diverse populations, and sustaining economic prosperity. Architectural expansion and urban development reinforced imperial authority, while fiscal and military systems ensured operational capacity. At the same time, ongoing frontier pressures, complex social dynamics, and the challenges of coordinating distant provinces revealed structural vulnerabilities that would shape the Almoravid trajectory in subsequent decades. Ali ibn Yusuf's governance demonstrates the delicate balance between inherited institutional strength and the practical demands of sustaining a transcontinental empire. Cultural achievements marked this era despite growing tension. Architecture reflected the Almoravids' mature imperial identity. During the reigns of Yusuf ibn Tashfin and Ali ibn Yusuf, Almoravid rulers actively promoted architectural and cultural initiatives that both reinforced political authority and expressed the empire's ideological coherence. Archaeological surveys and historical sources, including Ibn Khaldun and Andalusi chroniclers, reveal a systematic program of urban fortification, mosque construction, and civic development across North Africa and Al-Andalus. These projects were closely integrated with administrative and military strategies, reflecting a governance model in which material culture both legitimized and facilitated imperial control. In Marrakesh, the empire's political and administrative hub, major architectural projects transformed the city into a center of authority and culture. Fortified walls were extended and reinforced, incorporating defensive towers and strategically placed gates to protect against potential uprisings and external incursions. Ribbit-style fortifications on the city's periphery provided both security and religious function, housing scholars and warriors in a structure that symbolized the synthesis of military and spiritual oversight. Excavations indicate the use of stone foundations and mud brick superstructures, demonstrating technical adaptation to available materials and local environmental conditions. Religious architecture received particular emphasis. Mosques constructed during this period served not only as centers of worship, but also as instruments of social cohesion and legal enforcement. In Marrakesh and Fez, large congregational mosques were commissioned, incorporating hypostyle halls, courtyards, and minarets designed to accommodate both religious practice and public assembly. Inscriptions and decorative motifs, geometric patterns, Kufic calligraphy, and arabesques reinforced Maliki orthodoxy and conveyed ideological messages. These structures facilitated the dissemination of religious norms while visibly projecting Almoravid authority in urban landscapes. Urban renewal extended beyond religious and military structures to civic infrastructure, including water management, markets, and public granaries. Hydraulic engineering projects, such as canals and cisterns, ensured reliable water supply for residential, commercial, and agricultural use. Market layouts were standardized to support regulated commerce, while public granaries secured food storage for both civilian populations and military contingents. Archaeological evidence demonstrates careful spatial planning, with integration of defense, commerce, and ritual spaces into a cohesive urban framework that reflected imperial oversight. In Al-Andalus, cities such as Seville, Granada, and Córdoba experienced architectural adaptation to Almoravid standards. Fortifications were reinforced or reconstructed, and mosques were expanded or newly constructed to align with Maliki practice. Urban elites were incorporated into civic projects, providing labor, financing, and artistic input. Decorative motifs, including horseshoe arches and geometric tilework, reflected both North African influence and Iberian artistic traditions, demonstrating the empire's capacity to synthesize diverse cultural elements under a unified ideological framework. This blending of styles conveyed Almoravid authority while respecting existing urban identities, facilitating smoother integration of annexed territories. Educational and intellectual patronage also flourished. Scholars and jurists were supported through the establishment of madrasas and library collections within key urban centers. Instruction in Maliki jurisprudence, Quranic studies, and Islamic sciences reinforced ideological uniformity and trained administrators and judges who would staff provincial and city-level courts. Contemporary chronicles note the presence of learned figures in Marrakesh and Fez, contributing to an intellectual climate that strengthened the empire's legitimacy and administrative capacity. This investment in education illustrates the Almoravids' recognition of knowledge as both a practical and symbolic instrument of statecraft. Artistic production paralleled architectural achievements. Decorative ceramics, carved wooden elements, and metalwork from this period exhibit distinctive Almoravid motifs, emphasizing geometric precision and religious symbolism. These artifacts, often integrated into mosques, palaces, and urban infrastructure, communicated ideological and aesthetic messages, reinforcing both religious orthodoxy and imperial prestige. Archaeological finds in both North Africa and Al-Andalus confirm the circulation of artisans and materials across the empire, suggesting coordinated support for craft production and aesthetic standardization. The cumulative effect of these projects was the articulation of a mature imperial identity. Architecture and material culture functioned as both practical instruments and symbolic representations of power, authority, and religious orthodoxy. Fortifications ensured security, mosques and madrasas reinforced social cohesion and legal conformity, and urban planning facilitated economic and administrative efficiency. Collectively, these achievements convey the Almoravid state's capacity to govern, defend, and culturally integrate a transcontinental domain. Despite these accomplishments, cultural development coexisted with emerging ideological and political challenges. Rival interpretations of Islamic law, regional autonomy ambitions, and external military pressures persisted alongside architectural and educational advancements. Nevertheless, the period demonstrates the Almoravids' strategic integration of material culture into governance, using urban and artistic investments to project legitimacy, unify populations, and sustain the empire's ideological and administrative coherence. In conclusion, the architectural and cultural achievements under Yusuf ibn Tashfin and Ali ibn Yusuf exemplify the Almoravids' ability to translate military and administrative strength into visible symbols of imperial identity. Fortifications, mosques, urban planning, and educational patronage reinforced political authority, integrated diverse populations, and promoted Maliki orthodoxy. Archaeological evidence and contemporary chronicles highlight a deliberate, coordinated approach to material culture that both reflected and reinforced the empire's maturity. These accomplishments established a foundation of urban, intellectual, and aesthetic coherence that defined the Almoravid Empire at its zenith. Yet beneath cultural growth, new ideological rivals emerged. The structures that once unified the empire began to show their limits. By the early 12th century, the Almoravid Empire faced growing internal and external pressures that challenged the cohesion established under Yusuf ibn Tashfin and Ali ibn Yusuf. Tribal divisions, administrative overextension, and recurrent military threats combined to strain the imperial system. Sources such as Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Adhari, and Andalusi chroniclers document both the structural causes and consequences of these stresses, illustrating how systemic vulnerabilities emerged despite previous institutional strength. Tribal tensions were a persistent source of internal instability. The Lamtuna, Gadala, and Masufa contingents, which had formed the backbone of Almoravid authority, increasingly contested access to administrative positions, fiscal revenues, and military command. Historical accounts indicate that disputes over resource allocation and regional governance occasionally escalated into localized uprisings or outright refusal of service. These conflicts reflect the enduring influence of tribal affiliations and highlight the difficulties inherent in maintaining a centralized empire reliant on mobile, ethnically and geographically diverse forces. Iberian military setbacks compounded these pressures. Although Almoravid forces had initially stabilized the Taifa kingdoms, Christian kingdoms in northern Iberia, including Leon, Castile, and Aragon, began intensifying campaigns along frontier zones. Incidents such as the recapture of strategic fortresses and intermittent raids disrupted trade, weakened fiscal bases, and required repeated military mobilization. Chroniclers note that coordination between North African and Andalusi forces was increasingly challenging, and local Andalusi commanders sometimes resisted centralized orders, revealing the limits of administrative reach across the Strait of Gibraltar and within heterogeneous urban environments. Administrative strain was also evident in urban and rural governance. As the empire expanded, maintaining uniform enforcement of Maliki jurisprudence, taxation, and legal oversight became increasingly complex. Governors in distant provinces often exercised considerable autonomy, sometimes prioritizing local concerns over central directives. This decentralization, while pragmatic in managing vast territories, eroded centralized authority and exposed inconsistencies in fiscal and judicial enforcement. Contemporary documents highlight the challenge of balancing local autonomy with imperial cohesion, a tension that became a structural factor in the empire's decline. Economic pressures further exacerbated internal instability. Trans-Saharan trade, while still significant, faced disruption from shifting regional alliances, competition with independent merchants, and occasional raiding along caravan routes. Urban and rural taxation, dependent on both agricultural production and trade revenue, increasingly struggled to support military campaigns and public infrastructure. The combination of declining revenues, rising military expenditures, and administrative inefficiencies created fiscal bottlenecks that undermined the capacity of central authorities to respond effectively to crises. Ideological cohesion, once a cornerstone of Almoravid legitimacy, also faced challenges. While Maliki orthodoxy continued to be promoted, alternative interpretations of Islamic law and reformist movements began to gain traction, particularly in the Maghreb. Chroniclers describe dissatisfaction among scholars and local elites with certain policies, reflecting both doctrinal disputes and broader socio-political tensions. These ideological divergences, though initially limited in scope, signaled the emergence of forces capable of contesting Almoravid authority and mobilizing support for new movements. Externally, the empire confronted growing pressure from Christian kingdoms, particularly in the north of Iberia. Military campaigns demanded sustained troop mobilization and resource allocation, drawing attention away from internal governance. Strategic setbacks, including losses at frontier fortifications and recurring raids, highlighted the limits of Almoravid logistical networks and revealed vulnerabilities in command coordination. The necessity of defending distant territories underscored structural weaknesses that internal cohesion alone could no longer fully mitigate. Collectively, these factors, tribal tensions, military setbacks, administrative strain, economic pressures, and emerging ideological challenges, created a climate of systemic stress. The combination of internal division and external threat demonstrated that even a centralized and ideologically unified empire could face decline if structural resilience was insufficient. Historians interpret this period as a critical transitional moment, in which institutional strengths preserved nominal authority but could not prevent gradual fragmentation. In conclusion, by the early decades of the 12th century, the Almoravid Empire was exhibiting clear signs of internal strain. Tribal rivalries, logistical challenges in Iberia, fiscal pressures, and emerging ideological dissent combined to test the limits of administrative and military structures. While the empire retained significant territorial control and institutional sophistication, these pressures foreshadowed the rise of competing forces and the eventual emergence of reformist movements that would challenge Almoravid dominance. Against this backdrop, a new reformist movement arose. A new vision of reform challenged Almoravid legitimacy. During the early 12th century, the Almoravid Empire faced not only military and administrative pressures, but also a profound ideological challenge from the emerging Almohad movement. This movement, led by the Mahdi figure Ibn Tumurt, originated in the High Atlas region of Morocco and presented a doctrinal critique of Almoravid practices. Contemporary sources, including Ibn Abi Zar and later historians such as Ibn Khaldun, document Ibn Tumurt's call for strict monotheism, rigorous enforcement of Islamic law, and moral reform, establishing the movement as both a religious and political threat to Almoravid authority. Ibn Tumurt, a Berber scholar from the Masmuda Confederation, traveled extensively in Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, studying Maliki jurisprudence and engaging with various Islamic currents. Returning to the High Atlas in the 1110s, he articulated a vision of reform that emphasized absolute monotheism, ethical rigor, and rejection of what he perceived as Almoravid doctrinal laxity. His teachings criticized both the Almoravid court and urban elites, arguing that the empire had deviated from authentic Islamic principles. This ideological stance resonated with local communities, particularly among Masmuda and other High Atlas tribes, who found in Ibn Tumurt's message a framework that combined religious orthodoxy with the promise of social and political renewal. Organizationally, the Almohad movement was structured to support both religious indoctrination and military mobilization. Ibn Tumurt established a hierarchical system of disciples and representatives, creating networks capable of enforcing doctrinal conformity and recruiting warriors. Tribal alliances were reinforced through oaths of loyalty and coordinated military training. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that ribbit-style centers in the High Atlas functioned as both educational hubs and logistical bases, facilitating the dissemination of doctrine while preparing followers for eventual confrontation with the Almoravids. The movement's combination of ideological rigor and organizational discipline distinguished it from previous reformist efforts, including those that had initially inspired Almoravid formation. The appeal of the Almohads extended beyond religious doctrine. The movement addressed socio-political grievances, including perceived marginalization of High Atlas tribes and dissatisfaction with Almoravid governance. Ibn Tumurt's message offered both spiritual legitimacy and tangible prospects for political influence, creating a coalition that united religious zeal with tribal cohesion. Contemporary chronicles indicate that tribal communities were drawn to the Almohads not merely for doctrinal reasons, but also for the promise of participation in a reformist political order that challenged entrenched hierarchies and centralized authority. The ideological critique of the Almoravids was particularly potent because it targeted the empire's core claim to religious legitimacy. While the Almoravids had relied on Maliki orthodoxy as a unifying principle, the Almohads accused them of compromise, doctrinal laxity, and moral corruption. Ibn Tumart's teachings emphasized strict monotheism and the purification of religious practice, directly challenging Almoravid authority over both legal and moral spheres. This confrontation transformed theological debate into a basis for political mobilization, illustrating the capacity of doctrinal movements to influence imperial stability in medieval North Africa. The spread of the Almohad movement in the High Atlas coincided with broader structural strains in the Almoravid Empire. Military overstretch, fiscal pressures, and tribal tensions created vulnerabilities that Ibn Tumart's movement could exploit. By presenting a disciplined, ideologically coherent alternative, the Almohads gained followers who were both spiritually motivated and strategically positioned to exert pressure on Almoravid strongholds. This convergence of religious authority and tactical advantage exemplifies how ideological movements could translate moral critique into political and military challenge during this period. By the 1120s, Ibn Tumart's organization had established a network of loyalists and fortified centers capable of sustained opposition. Recruitment focused on Mazmuda tribes, but ideological messaging reached broader communities, emphasizing both religious reform and political renewal. The movement's cohesion and discipline contrasted with the fragmented and increasingly strained Almoravid structures, highlighting the effectiveness of combining religious ideology with tribal and military mobilization. Scholars interpret this development as a turning point, marking the emergence of a formidable challenger to Almoravid hegemony that was capable of translating doctrinal authority into concrete political and military action. In conclusion, the Almohad movement under Ibn Tumart represented a significant ideological and organizational challenge to the Almoravid Empire. By combining strict doctrinal reform, disciplined organizational structures, and strategic alliances with High Atlas tribes, the Almohads created both a moral critique and a practical alternative to Almoravid governance. The movement's appeal among local populations, coupled with its capacity for military mobilization, set the stage for a confrontation that would reshape the political and religious landscape of the Maghreb. The emergence of this reformist force illustrates the interplay of ideology, tribal dynamics, and military organization in determining the trajectory of medieval North African empires. This challenge soon transformed into direct confrontation. By the mid-12th century, Almoravid authority was in full retreat. By the 1140s, the Almoravid Empire faced irreversible military and political pressures from the ascendant Almohads. Following Ibn Tumart's death in 1130, leadership passed to Abd al-Mumin, who consolidated the movement's organization, disciplined its forces, and directed systematic campaigns against Almoravid holdings. Contemporary chronicles, including Ibn Abi Zar and later accounts by Ibn Khaldun, record the progressive loss of key territories, illustrating both the strategic competence of the Almohads and the structural weaknesses within the Almoravid administration. The northern and interior provinces of Morocco fell first under Almohad pressure. Fortifications in Fez, Rabat, and the surrounding Rif region were besieged and, in some cases, abandoned due to insufficient military support and local dissension. Chroniclers note that urban populations, disaffected by heavy taxation and strict enforcement of Maliki orthodoxy, often offered passive or active assistance to Almohad forces. This combination of military pressure and local acquiescence undermined the Almoravids' ability to project authority beyond Marrakesh and other central strongholds. The decisive campaign against Marrakesh culminated in 1147, marking the symbolic and practical end of Almoravid rule. Abd al-Mumin's forces approached the city with a combination of direct siege tactics and negotiated surrenders from surrounding territories. Archaeological evidence and written accounts suggest that the Almohads systematically dismantled Almoravid fortifications, replaced administrative officials, and imposed new judicial structures aligned with Almohad doctrinal principles. The fall of Marrakesh represented not only a territorial loss but also the collapse of the empire's political and administrative core, severing the central coordination of military, fiscal, and legal networks. Al-Andalus also experienced Almohad advances during this period, though the conquest proceeded more gradually. Southern Iberian cities previously under Almoravid control faced repeated incursions, rebellions, and eventual realignment with Almohad authority. Historians note that the disjointed coordination between North African and Iberian provinces hindered Almoravid defense, emphasizing the logistical challenges of maintaining transcontinental rule under sustained ideological and military opposition. The collapse of Almoravid structures was marked by the dissolution of centralized administration and military command. Regional governors, once loyal to Marrakesh, either defected, were replaced, or lost effective control. Judicial and religious authorities aligned with Almoravid Maliki jurisprudence were supplanted by Almohad-appointed scholars, reshaping the ideological landscape. Economic systems, including control over trans-Saharan trade routes, shifted as Almohad forces assumed command of caravan networks, markets, and taxation. This comprehensive replacement illustrates the capacity of the Almohads to exploit both ideological and structural vulnerabilities to effect rapid imperial transition. Despite the collapse, some remnants of Almoravid society persisted in peripheral regions, particularly among nomadic and semi-nomadic Berber groups. These communities maintained local autonomy and preserved elements of Almoravid military and social organization for decades, though their influence on broader imperial politics was minimal. Contemporary and later sources highlight these pockets of resistance as testament to the resilience of tribal structures even after the fall of central authority, indicating that the disintegration of the empire did not immediately erase its social and cultural imprint. In conclusion, by the mid-12th century, Almoravid authority had largely disintegrated under coordinated Almohad campaigns. The fall of Marrakesh in 1147 symbolized the effective end of centralized control, with subsequent losses in northern Morocco and Al-Andalus confirming the empire's collapse. Administrative, military, and economic networks that had sustained the dynasty for over a century were dismantled or absorbed by Almohad structures. Nevertheless, residual Almoravid communities, cultural practices, and institutional legacies persisted, establishing the conditions for continuity in certain social and legal frameworks, even as the empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Despite collapse, the Almoravid impact endured. Almoravid rule reshaped the political map of northwest Africa. The Almoravid dynasty, emerging from the Sanhaja Berber Confederation, established institutional and military frameworks that profoundly influenced subsequent state formation across North Africa. Their model of governance, combining centralized authority with tribal coalitions, served as a template for later Maghrebi dynasties, including the Almohads and Marinids. Contemporary and later sources, including Ibn Khaldun and al-Bakri, emphasize the durability of Almoravid administrative, legal, and military innovations, which became reference points for regional rulers navigating the complex terrain of the Western Sahara and Maghreb. Administratively, the Almoravids developed a system that integrated urban centers, tribal hinterlands, and frontier zones. Governors, qadis, and military commanders were appointed based on loyalty and competence, providing a balance between central oversight and local autonomy. This structure allowed for efficient tax collection, legal enforcement, and coordination of military operations across a geographically diverse empire. Subsequent dynasties adopted similar mechanisms, retaining the dual emphasis on centralized policy and local governance to manage nomadic and settled populations alike. Militarily, the Almoravids institutionalized a disciplined cavalry-based force drawn from the Lamtuna, Gudala, and Masufa tribes. Their strategies combined mobility, fortification, and coordinated campaigns, which enabled control over the Sahara, Moroccan plains, and southern Iberian territories. These operational models informed the organization of later Maghrebi armies, providing enduring templates for frontier defense, siegecraft, and rapid troop deployment. Records indicate that even after Almoravid decline, former commanders and tribal units were integrated into successor dynasties' military apparatuses, demonstrating continuity of martial organization. Economic and logistical precedents were equally influential. By controlling trans-Saharan trade routes, regulating commerce in key cities such as Marrakesh, Fez, and Sijil Massa, and coordinating maritime and overland exchange networks, the Almoravids created enduring economic infrastructures. Subsequent states inherited these networks, benefiting from established routes for gold, salt, and agricultural goods. The integration of fiscal and trade systems into administrative structures reinforced the empire's capacity to project power, a strategy replicated by later North African polities seeking to maintain territorial cohesion. Legal and religious administration also left a lasting imprint on state formation. By institutionalizing Maliki jurisprudence across North Africa and Al-Andalus, the Almoravids established a model for ideological legitimacy that linked governance with religious orthodoxy. Qadis and jurists trained under Almoravid standards became embedded in local institutions, and the uniform application of law reinforced centralized authority while accommodating regional diversity. Later dynasties, including the Almohads and Marinids, either adapted or redefined these structures, acknowledging the functional and symbolic role of religion in statecraft. The Almoravid emphasis on urban planning and infrastructure further shaped North African state development. Fortified cities, water management systems, and organized markets created replicable templates for integrating military, administrative, and economic functions. Archaeological evidence from Marrakesh, Fez, and Aghmat demonstrates that these urban designs facilitated both governance and social cohesion, influencing the spatial and functional organization of cities under subsequent rulers. This integration of physical infrastructure with administrative efficiency exemplified a systemic approach to empire building that endured beyond the dynasty's collapse. In conclusion, the Almoravid dynasty contributed foundational models of governance, military organization, economic integration, and urban planning that reshaped the political landscape of Northwest Africa. Their innovations created durable institutional precedents, offering later dynasties a combination of administrative efficiency, ideological legitimacy, and logistical capability. By balancing centralized authority with tribal coalitions, organizing disciplined military forces, and embedding legal and economic frameworks across diverse regions, the Almoravids provided a template for sustained state formation in the Maghreb. Their influence extended beyond their temporal rule, ensuring that the structural principles established during the 11th and 12th centuries remained central to the governance strategies of subsequent North African empires. Their religious influence was equally notable. The Almoravids established legal norms that persisted for centuries. The Almoravid dynasty exerted a profound and enduring influence on the religious landscape of both the Maghreb and Al-Andalus through the promotion of Maliki jurisprudence, the construction of religious institutions, and the standardization of clerical authority. Their approach combined legal codification, urban infrastructure, and administrative oversight to ensure that Islamic orthodoxy was systematically enforced across a geographically diverse empire. Contemporary accounts, including those of Ibn Adhari and al-Bakri, emphasize the dynasty's rigorous implementation of Maliki law as a central pillar of both governance and social cohesion. Maliki jurisprudence functioned as the ideological backbone of Almoravid authority. Qadis and jurists trained under imperial auspices were deployed across major urban centers and frontier regions to adjudicate disputes, regulate commerce, and oversee personal status law. The uniform application of Maliki law served multiple functions. It legitimized Almoravid governance, provided predictable legal frameworks for urban and rural populations, and reinforced moral authority by linking political power to religious orthodoxy. Historical evidence indicates that these structures were particularly effective in integrating heterogeneous communities, including Berber tribes, urban merchants, and Andalusi elites, under a shared legal and religious framework. The construction and enhancement of mosques was another significant mechanism through which the Almoravids influenced religious life. In cities such as Marrakesh, Fez, and Córdoba, large congregational mosques were commissioned, often incorporating architectural elements that reflected both North African and Andalusi traditions. Archaeological evidence demonstrates careful planning of prayer halls, minarets, and courtyards to accommodate growing populations and facilitate public assembly. These institutions were not merely religious centers. They functioned as hubs of learning, social regulation, and administrative oversight, linking legal, spiritual, and civic functions under a unified Almoravid vision. Standardization of religious authority extended beyond architecture to clerical hierarchy and educational institutions. Madrasas and ribats served as centers for the training of jurists, scholars, and administrators, ensuring doctrinal conformity and administrative competence. This network created a class of educated elites capable of interpreting Maliki law consistently, resolving disputes in accordance with imperial norms, and reinforcing centralized authority. Historical chronicles indicate that the systematic education and deployment of these figures helped sustain Almoravid influence in both urban and rural settings, embedding a coherent religious structure that endured beyond the dynasty's political decline. The influence of Almoravid religious policy also extended into Al-Andalus, where the integration of Iberian Muslim communities required careful balancing of existing traditions with imperial orthodoxy. Almoravid authorities reinforced mosque administration, standardized Friday sermons, khutbahs, and oversaw the training of Andalusi scholars in Maliki jurisprudence. This harmonization not only strengthened religious cohesion but also facilitated political control by aligning legal and religious norms with central authority. The persistence of Maliki practice in Al-Andalus after the Almoravid period demonstrates the long-term effectiveness of these measures in shaping regional religious identity. Moreover, the Almoravids' emphasis on orthodoxy had broader socio-political implications. By linking law, religious observance, and governance, they established a framework in which legitimacy was inseparable from doctrinal adherence. This integration contributed to the empire's cohesion during its expansion and served as a model for later dynasties, including the Almohads and Marinids, who either adapted or contested Almoravid legal and religious structures. Scholars of Islamic intellectual history highlight this period as pivotal in the standardization of Maliki jurisprudence across North Africa and Iberia, influencing legal and religious practice for centuries. In conclusion, the Almoravid dynasty profoundly shaped the religious landscape of the Maghreb and Al-Andalus through systematic implementation of Maliki law, construction of mosques, and centralization of clerical authority. These measures reinforced political legitimacy, facilitated social cohesion, and created enduring frameworks for legal and religious practice. By establishing standardized norms and integrating diverse communities under a coherent doctrinal system, the Almoravids left a lasting imprint on Islamic intellectual and institutional history, ensuring that their influence extended far beyond the temporal boundaries of the empire. Their legacy continues to be reinterpreted by modern scholars. Modern scholarship continues to refine the Almoravid narrative. Contemporary understanding of the Almoravid dynasty has been shaped significantly by modern historical and archaeological scholarship. Historians, working from medieval chronicles, numismatic evidence, architectural remains, and material culture, have sought to reconstruct the political, religious, and economic dimensions of the empire with greater nuance. Scholars such as Nehemiah Levsian, Ronald Messier, and Clifford Bosworth have emphasized both the structural achievements and the limitations of Almoravid statecraft, highlighting the dynasty's role in shaping North African and Iberian history while situating it within broader Islamic and Saharan contexts. One focus of modern historiography is the Almoravids' identity as a Berber dynasty operating within an Islamic framework. Early scholarship often portrayed the Almoravids simplistically as either tribal warriors or religious zealots. Contemporary research, however, stresses the synthesis of tribal organization, military discipline, and religious orthodoxy that define the empire. Archaeological evidence from Marrakesh, Fez, and southern Iberian sites corroborates textual sources, demonstrating a complex society capable of urban administration, large-scale trade coordination, and architectural innovation. These findings have prompted historians to reinterpret Almoravid authority as both pragmatic and ideologically informed, rather than purely coercive or symbolic. Debates regarding Almoravid orthodoxy and religious policy are also prominent. Medieval sources often emphasize Ibn Yassin's strict enforcement of Maliki jurisprudence and moral regulation, but modern scholars investigate the practicalities and limits of this enforcement. Numismatic evidence, legal documents, and architectural inscriptions reveal variation in implementation across regions, suggesting that Almoravid orthodoxy was negotiated within local contexts rather than uniformly imposed. These analyses contribute to a more sophisticated understanding of how ideology intersected with governance, illustrating the interplay between doctrinal rigor and administrative pragmatism. Economic and logistical structures have likewise been reassessed. Scholars studying trans-Saharan trade, caravan networks, and urban markets demonstrate that Almoravid control over gold, salt, and other commodities was both systematic and adaptive. Archaeological surveys at sites such as Oudighost and Sijilmassa, combined with analysis of Mediterranean trade records, provide empirical support for the dynasty's role in facilitating interregional commerce. Historians interpret these findings as evidence of a durable economic framework that underpinned both political authority and social integration, reinforcing the Almoravid status as a commercially astute power. Modern historiography also addresses the empire's military organization and territorial management. Detailed studies of battlefield accounts, fortification remains, and troop movements have highlighted the disciplined integration of tribal cavalry, strategic use of ribats, and coordination of trans-Saharan and Iberian campaigns. These insights underscore the degree to which military effectiveness was intertwined with administrative capability, religious motivation, and logistical planning. The combination of textual and archaeological sources allows scholars to construct a dynamic picture of Almoravid expansion, consolidation, and eventual decline. Finally, contemporary interpretations consider the lasting legacy of the Almoravids in broader North African and Iberian history. Scholars emphasize the dynasty's contribution to the institutionalization of Maliki law, the urbanization of Maghrebi cities, and the continuity of trans-Saharan trade networks. Comparative studies with the Almohads, Marinids, and later Andalusi states highlight both direct influence and contested memory, demonstrating how the Almoravids shaped subsequent political and religious developments. Modern historiography frames the dynasty as a transitional force, bridging tribal confederation, religious reform, and imperial administration. In conclusion, the Almoravid dynasty continues to be reinterpreted through modern historical and archaeological research. By examining the interplay of tribal organization, religious orthodoxy, administrative innovation, military strategy, and economic networks, scholars have refined the narrative of Almoravid power and influence. The combination of textual analysis, material evidence, and comparative study has provided a nuanced, evidence-based understanding of the dynasty's achievements and limitations. This modern historiographical perspective situates the Almoravids as a formative empire whose institutional, religious, and economic innovations resonated across North Africa and Iberia, leaving a legacy that remains central to the study of medieval Islamic history. If you found this exploration of the Almoravid dynasty insightful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history of civilizations and empires. Enable notifications to follow our chronological series, where archaeology, texts, and scholarly research reveal how past societies shaped the world we live in today. For a closer look at maps, trade routes, and urban developments discussed in this video, check the timestamps and resources in the description below. Join us in uncovering the structures, strategies, and ideas that defined human history.